Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The house had always felt wrong, not in any way I could explain to my sister when she called from Barcelona, asking how I was managing alone with the kids. Not in any way that would make sense if I tried to tell someone at the hardware store in town why I needed another deadbolt for the butcher shop door. The wrongness lived in the spaces between things, in the gap where the newer wing met the original structure, in the silence that pooled in corners despite the constant settling of old timber, in the way shadows fell at impossible angles when the church bells rang across the street. I'd agreed to watch the house for 2 weeks while my brother and his wife attended some medical conference in Switzerland. Their kids were easy enough. Teenagers who barely emerged from their rooms except to raid the refrigerator. The house, though. The house was something else entirely. It sat like a broken letter against the landscape, its L shape creating a courtyard that caught wind in strange spirals. The long arm stretched parallel to the road, while the shorter section jutted back toward the cemetery that hadn't seen a proper burial in 3 centuries. My brother had bought it for the history, he said. For the character. The real estate agent had mentioned something about the ground it sat on. Consecrated, then deconsecrated, then consecrated again after they stopped burying criminals here in the 1700s. The kind of detail that adds color to dinner party conversation, but settles differently when you're alone at night, listening to the house breathe around you. The church across the way had been watching this plot of land since the 15th century. Its stones had witnessed whatever darkness had soaked into the soil here, whatever desperate final moments had played out where the foundation now rested. During the day, it seemed protective, almost paternal. At night, its silhouette became something else. A judge, perhaps, or a guard keeping watch over something that should stay buried. The first 3 nights passed without incident. I established a routine. Check the locks, set the alarm, read in the living room until the kids went to bed, then retreat to the guest room in the newer wing. The house would perform its nightly symphony of creaks and sighs. The radiators would knock their Morse code messages through the walls, and eventually, I'd sleep. It was Tuesday when the pattern changed. I was reading in the living room, the kids already asleep upstairs, when I heard it. Footsteps in the hallway above. Slow, deliberate, the kind of walk someone makes when they're trying not to wake others. I lowered my book, listening. Old houses settle, I told myself. Wood expands and contracts. The kids were probably just getting water. The footsteps continued, moving along the upstairs hallway toward the stairs. There was weight to them, a rhythm that matched human gait too perfectly to be random settling. Each footfall pressed into the old floorboards with intention, with purpose. I stood, setting my book aside. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and began descending. One by one, each step creaking in sequence, the sound as clear as if someone were walking right beside me. But the stairs were in full view from where I stood, and they were empty. My throat constricted. The footsteps continued their descent, invisible feet finding each worn step with practiced familiarity. I wanted to call out, to demand who was there, but my voice had retreated somewhere deep inside my chest. The sound reached the bottom of the stairs, and then, impossibly, the footsteps walked past me, past the exact spot where I stood frozen, close enough that I felt the air shift, cold and thick like disturbed water. They continued into the old butcher shop. The butcher shop. Of course, my brother had left it mostly untouched during renovations, preserving the original stone floor and the old drain in the center where blood once ran. It connected to the older part of the house, a room that predated the rest by at least a century. The footsteps moved across its threshold and stopped. I stood in the living room for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, waiting, listening. The house had gone quiet again, that particular kind of quiet that feels like held breath. Eventually, I forced myself to walk to the butcher shop doorway and peer inside. Moonlight filtered through the single window, illuminating the empty room. The old meat hooks still hung from the ceiling beams, casting shadows like hanging men. Nothing. No one. I barely slept that night, every small sound jolting me awake. When morning came, gray and subdued through the curtains, I tried to rationalize what I'd heard. The kids, obviously. Sound traveling strangely through old walls, my imagination, fueled by too many late nights in an unfamiliar house. But the next night, it happened again. Same time, just after 10 o'clock. Same pattern. Footsteps along the upstairs hallway, down the stairs, past the living room, into the butcher shop. This time I was ready. I'd positioned myself at the bottom of the stairs, flashlight in hand, determined to see whatever was making the sound. The footsteps began above me, and I trained the flashlight beam on each step as the sound descended. Nothing. Nothing but the sound of someone walking, the wood groaning under invisible weight. When the footsteps reached the bottom and moved past me, I felt it again. That displacement of air, that chill that seemed to come from inside my bones rather than outside them. The temperature dropped so suddenly I could see my breath misting in the flashlight beam. I followed the sound into the butcher shop, my flashlight sweeping the empty room. The footsteps had stopped again, right in the center, where the old drain sat like a dark mouth in the floor. I knelt beside it, pressing my ear close to the metal grate. From somewhere far below came a sound like breathing, or wind, or something trying to speak through layers of earth and time. By the fourth night, I'd had enough. I called my brother, trying to keep my voice casual, as I asked about the house's history. He laughed, told me about the previous owner who'd sworn the place was haunted, about the family before that who'd left after only 6 months. Stories every old house collected, he said. Nothing to worry about. But his voice carried something else beneath the reassurance. A recognition, perhaps, or a carefully managed concern. When I pressed him about the footsteps specifically, he went quiet for a moment before saying he'd never heard anything like that. The pause before his answer told me otherwise. I started spending my evenings in the newer wing, as far from the stairs and the butcher shop as possible, but the footsteps found me anyway. They would begin at 10 o'clock sharp, walk their prescribed route, and end at that drain. Always the same. Always alone. I tried recording them on my phone, but the playback captured only the house's ambient sounds. No footsteps, no creaking stairs, nothing but my own breathing getting faster and more ragged with each passing night. The kids seemed oblivious. They came and went, absorbed in their phones and their music, never mentioning any strange sounds or cold spots or the way shadows seemed to move independently of their sources in the butcher shop. It was only me. The footsteps walked only for me. By the second week, I'd started seeing things in my peripheral vision. Dark shapes that shouldn't be there. Movements and reflections that didn't match reality. The church across the street had taken on a different character. Its windows like eyes that never blinked. Its bells counting down to something I couldn't name. I found myself checking the locks obsessively, barricading the butcher shop door with furniture each night, only to find it moved aside each morning with no explanation. On my last night in the house, I decided to wait in the butcher shop itself. If something was going to happen, I wanted to face it directly. I positioned myself in the corner, back against the wall, with a clear view of both the doorway and the drain. 10 o'clock came. The footsteps began upstairs, and I gripped the baseball bat I'd brought from the garage. Down the stairs they came, steady and unhurried, along the hallway, past the living room. I held my breath as they approached the butcher shop doorway. They entered the room, and this time I saw it. Not a figure exactly, but a distortion in the air, a place where the darkness was darker, where the moonlight bent wrong. It moved toward the drain with purpose, with familiarity, and as it passed, I smelled earth and copper, and something chemical, like old preservatives. The distortion stopped at the drain and seemed to look down into it. Then, slowly, it turned toward me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The darkness where a face should have been regarded me with what felt like curiosity, or hunger, or both. The air grew so cold that frost began forming on the windows, on the metal of the drain, on my skin. I felt my thoughts beginning to scatter. felt something pulling at the edges of my consciousness, trying to pry me open like a shell. Then the church bells rang. Not the regular hourly chime, but a frantic, discordant clanging that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The distortion turned toward the sound, and for a moment, I saw it more clearly. Tall, thin, wearing what might have been work clothes from another century. Then it simply dispersed. Like smoke caught by wind, it came apart and was gone. I ran. Out of the butcher shop, out of the house, across the street to the church. The door was open, and inside I found the pastor, an elderly man I'd seen but never spoken to. He looked at me with knowing eyes and simply said that some ground never forgets what it's held, that some places keep their dead close, especially those who were buried without rites, without forgiveness. He came back with me to the house, moving through each room with his prayers and his holy water, paying special attention to the butcher shop. He stood over the drain for a long moment, muttering in Latin, before sprinkling water in a pattern that seemed more like binding than blessing. When he finished, the house felt different. Not lighter exactly, but settled, like something that had been straining against its restraints had finally been secured. My brother returned the next day, and I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, then showed me something he'd found in the house's records. A newspaper clipping from 1892 about a butcher who'd been accused of selling tainted meat that killed 3 people. He'd been found dead in his shop, drained of blood, though no one was ever charged with his murder. The shop had been built on the exact spot where the town had once disposed of executed criminals, throwing their bodies into a shared pit without ceremony or marker. The footsteps haven't returned since the blessing. My brother says they never hear them, that the house is quiet now, peaceful even. But sometimes, when I'm lying in my own bed in my own house miles away, I wake at 10 o'clock sharp and listen. I hear my own house settling, my own stairs creaking, and I wonder if the footsteps have simply found a new route, if that distortion in the darkness has learned to travel beyond its original boundaries. I wonder if the blessing held it in place, or if it set something free. The church bells still ring in my dreams, but now they sound like a warning that came too late. And sometimes in the corner of my eye, I catch glimpses of places where the darkness is darker, where the air bends wrong. I tell myself it's just my imagination, just the lingering effects of those 2 weeks in that wrong house. But late at night, when the world is quiet and still, I can feel something watching from those dark corners, waiting, walking its endless route through spaces between walls, through ground that remembers everything it's held, through the thin places where the dead refuse to stay buried. The pastor calls occasionally, asking how I'm doing. His voice carries the same knowing tone it had that night in the church. He never mentions the footsteps directly, but he always ends our conversations the same way, reminding me that some blessings are boundaries, not exorcisms, that some things can only be contained, never truly banished. I don't ask what he means. I already know, because last night, for the first time since leaving that house, I heard them again. Not in my dreams, but in my own hallway. The same measured pace, the same weight, the same destination, always moving toward some invisible butcher shop, some unseen drain where old debts wait to be collected. I've started leaving lights on, started checking locks, started avoiding the corner of my vision where darkness pools thicker than it should. Because I understand now what the house was trying to tell me, what those footsteps were seeking night after night. They weren't walking through that house. They were walking through every house built on broken ground, every structure raised over unmarked graves, every home that stands where the condemned once fell. The blessing didn't stop them. It only taught them to walk quieter, to step more carefully through the spaces we've built over their suffering. And now that I've heard them, really heard them, I don't think they'll ever stop walking. The house watches me sometimes, not my brother's house, but all houses. In their shadows and their settling sounds, in their too quiet moments and their sudden chills. I feel that same wrongness I felt that first night. That sense of standing on ground that remembers too much, of walls that have absorbed more than just time. The footsteps are everywhere now. In every creaking board, every settling beam, Every sound that shouldn't be there but is. They walk through our modern world on paths carved centuries ago, following routes that existed before our foundations were laid, before our walls were raised, before we thought we could build over the past and forget it was there. 10 o'clock comes every night, and every night I listen, and every night they walk. Story 2. The bartender's words still echo in my skull as I stumble through the parking lot. You're done. Get out before I call the cops. The December wind cuts through my jacket like it isn't even there, and I can barely feel my fingers anymore. Minnesota winters don't forgive, especially not at 2 in the morning when you're too drunk to remember your own address. I know I shouldn't have gone to her memorial. 5 years since my sister disappeared into a night just like this one, and every year I make the same mistake, trying to drown the memory in whiskey until even the bartenders can't stand to look at me anymore. The snow crunches under my boots, but the sound seems wrong somehow, like it's coming from behind me instead of beneath me. I spin around, nearly losing my balance, and squint into the darkness. Nothing but the neon bar sign bleeding red into the white parking lot. But there's something else, a sensation crawling up my spine that has nothing to do with the cold. Someone's watching me. I start walking faster, though I'm not entirely sure which direction leads home. The street lamps create pools of sickly yellow light that I stumble between, each shadow between them feeling deeper than it should. My breath fogs in front of me, and for a moment, I swear I see another cloud of breath floating beside mine, keeping pace. The ditch appears out of nowhere. 1 second I'm shuffling along the roadside. The next I'm tumbling down an embankment, snow filling my mouth and nose. I land hard, face first in a drift that must be 3 feet deep. The cold is beyond painful now. It's like being wrapped in television static, every nerve firing randomly. I try to push myself up, but my arms won't cooperate. The whiskey has turned my limbs into useless meat. I manage to roll onto my back, staring up at the starless sky. The snow keeps falling, each flake landing on my face like a tiny frozen kiss. This is how she must have felt, I think. This is how it ends. My eyes start to close. The cold isn't so bad anymore. Actually, it's almost warm now, like slipping into a bath. I've heard about this, how freezing to death tricks your brain into thinking you're comfortable. Part of me knows I should fight it, but the larger part just wants to sleep. Wake up. The voice tears through the silence like breaking glass. I jolt upright, heart hammering against my ribs. There's no one there. The ditch stretches empty in both directions, just white snow and black shadows. But I'm standing now, somehow. I don't remember getting to my feet. Move. This time the voice comes from directly behind my left ear, so close I can almost feel breath that isn't there. I stumble forward, climbing up the embankment with strength I shouldn't have. My hands are completely numb, but they grip the frozen grass and pull me up anyway, like someone else is controlling them. Back on the road, I start walking. No, I'm being walked. My legs move with purpose, turning left at an intersection I don't recognize, then right at another. The voice doesn't speak again, but I feel it there, pressed against my back like invisible hands pushing me forward. The familiar streets of my neighborhood materialize out of the blizzard like a magic trick. There's my house, windows dark, driveway covered in fresh snow. I fumble for my keys with fingers that feel like frozen sausages, and somehow manage to get inside. The warmth hits me like a physical force, and suddenly I'm on my knees in the entryway, shaking violently. Not from cold, from fear. Because now that I'm safe, now that I can think clearly, I realize something that makes my stomach turn to ice water. The voice that saved me. I recognize it. It's been 5 years, but I'd know it anywhere. The same voice that used to wake me up for school, that sang off key in the shower, that screamed my name the night she disappeared. My sister's voice. I stay there on the floor for hours, waiting for sunrise, trying to convince myself it was the whiskey, the cold, the grief playing tricks on my mind. But when I finally stand up and look at my phone, I see something that makes my blood freeze all over again. The tracking app shows my location history for the night. There's the bar, there's the spot where I fell into the ditch. But the path home, it's not the route I thought I took. According to the GPS, I walked 2 miles in the opposite direction from my house. I walked to Riverside Cemetery, spent 3 minutes there, then somehow appeared at my front door. The cemetery where we buried an empty casket 5 years ago. The cemetery I haven't visited since the funeral. There's snow on my jacket, melting now in the warm air. I brush it off with trembling hands, and something falls to the floor. A small silver bracelet, tarnished with age, the clasp broken. I know this bracelet. I gave it to her for her 18th birthday. She was wearing it the night she disappeared. I pick it up, and it's ice cold against my palm, colder than it should be, even after being outside. As I hold it up to the light, I notice something else. Fresh scratches on the inside of the band, like someone tried to carve something. I squint at the marks, trying to make out what they say. Still here. The words are barely visible, but they're there. And beneath them, more scratches that might be letters or might be nothing at all. I strain to read them, tilting the bracelet back and forth in the light. Still watching. My hands won't stop shaking. I want to call someone, anyone, but what would I say? That I got drunk and found my dead sister's jewelry? That I heard her voice in a blizzard? That somehow I teleported 2 miles without remembering it? I go to the kitchen and make coffee with hands that barely work, trying to think rationally. The bracelet sits on the counter, accusing me with its presence. Maybe someone planted it. Maybe I've had it all along and forgot. Maybe none of this is real, and I'm still dying in that ditch, my brain creating an elaborate fantasy as it shuts down. The coffee tastes like ash. I pour it out and make another cup, stronger this time. Outside, the snow has stopped, and the world looks deceptively peaceful, normal, like nothing happened. But then I see them, footprints in the snow leading from the street to my front door. Just one set. Mine, obviously. Except, they're facing the wrong direction. The footprints lead away from my house, not toward it. As if I walked out my front door backward, all the way to the street. I close my eyes, trying to remember those lost minutes at the cemetery. But there's nothing there. Just a black hole in my memory. When I open my eyes again, there's condensation on the kitchen window, and someone has drawn something in it from the outside. A single word. Remember. I grab my coat and rush outside, but there's no one there. No footprints except those impossible backward ones. The word on the window is already fading, and I'm starting to doubt I saw it at all. This is how it starts, isn't it? This is how you lose your mind. You see things that aren't there, hear voices of the dead, find objects that shouldn't exist. You tell yourself it's grief, it's guilt, it's anything but what your primitive brain keeps screaming, that something followed you home from that ditch. Or maybe something was already waiting for you there. I go back inside and lock the door, though I know locks won't help. Whatever saved me, whatever spoke with my sister's voice, it's not done with me. I can feel it in the air, like the pressure before a storm. Waiting. Watching. The bracelet still sits on my counter, and now I notice something else. There's dirt under my fingernails. Cemetery dirt. And on my boots, mud that wasn't there before, even though the ground should be frozen solid. I want to throw the bracelet away, but I can't bring myself to touch it again. Instead, I leave it there and retreat to my bedroom, pulling the covers over my head like a child. But sleep won't come. Every time I close my eyes, I hear that voice again. Wake up. Maybe I never did. Maybe I'm still in that ditch, snow covering my body, dreams flickering through a dying brain. Or maybe something pulled me back from the edge, something that won't let me go. Something that's been waiting 5 years for me to finally listen. The sun rises eventually, painting my bedroom walls pink and gold, but the chill won't leave my bones. I know I should go to work, pretend everything is normal, but I can't move. Because I finally understand what's happening. She didn't save me out of love. She saved me because she needs something. And those backward footprints, that visit to the cemetery I don't remember, I think I already gave it to her. I just don't know what it was yet. The bracelet is gone when I finally return to the kitchen. In its place, there's a small pile of snow that shouldn't exist, that cannot exist in my heated house. As I watch, it melts, leaving only a dark stain on my counter that looks like a handprint. A small hand. Her hand. Tonight, I know I'll dream of that ditch again, but this time, I won't be alone in it. She'll be there wearing that bracelet, covered in 5 years of winter, whispering secrets I'm not ready to hear. And when I wake up, if I wake up, I'll have to decide whether the voice that saved me was really trying to help, or if it was just bringing me closer to wherever she's been all this time. The stain on my counter won't wash away. I've tried everything, but it just sits there, darker than it should be, shaped like a reaching hand. Reaching for what? For me? Or for something I haven't realized I'm carrying? I check my phone one more time, hoping the GPS was wrong, hoping for any explanation that makes sense. But the tracking data is unchanged. 2 miles to the cemetery, 3 minutes of nothing. Then home. 3 minutes. What can you do in 3 minutes? What can be done to you? Outside, it started snowing again, and I swear, I can see someone standing in my backyard, just at the edge of visibility, waiting. But when I blink, there's nothing there but the falling snow and my own reflection in the window, pale and haunted, looking like I've already joined her wherever she's been all these years. Maybe I have. Maybe that's what those 3 minutes cost me. Maybe when that voice shouted, "Wake up," it wasn't talking to me at all. Maybe it was talking to something inside me that's been sleeping since the night she disappeared. Something that's finally awake now. Something that's wearing my face but isn't quite me anymore. I look at my hands, and they look wrong somehow. Too pale. Too still. Like they belong to someone else. Someone who's been waiting in the cold for 5 years. Someone who knows what really happens when you listen to voices in the winter dark. The snow keeps falling, and I keep watching it, and somewhere in the distance, I hear her voice again, singing that same off-key song she always loved. But this time, I'm singing along, even though I never knew the words before, even though I'm not sure anymore whose voice is coming out of my mouth. Story 3. The real estate agent's smile had been too wide when she handed us the keys. I remember thinking that at the time, though my wife dismissed it as paranoia, but there was something in the woman's eyes, relief maybe, as she practically sprinted back to her car after the closing. We stood there, our 18-month-old son squirming in my arms, staring at what would become our personal hell. The terrace house squatted between its neighbors like a diseased tooth in an otherwise healthy mouth. Victorian, the listing had said, though the bones of the place felt older, as if the Victorian builders had merely dressed up something more ancient in brick and mortar. The conservatory jutted from the back like a glass tumor, its iron framework twisted with age and neglect, overlooking the private woodland that had been the main selling point. Those trees should have been a warning. They pressed against the property line with an almost deliberate malevolence, their branches scraping the conservatory's glass panels whenever the wind picked up. Even on that first day, standing in what would become our living room, I could hear them, fingernails on glass, a constant reminder that nature wanted in. We moved in on a Tuesday. I remember because the microwave clock displayed 2:47 p.m. when I first noticed the shadow. I was heating up formula, watching the bottle rotate on the turntable, when something rushed past the kitchen window. The microwave's internal light flickered. No, that's not right. The light stayed on, but something blocked it, just for a second. A shadow that moved against the laws of physics, flowing upward when it should have fallen, lingering in the corners of my vision like an oil slick on water. My wife was upstairs, trying to get our son to nap in his new room. The house groaned around her footsteps, a symphony of settling wood and protesting joints that we'd learned to interpret like a foreign language. Every house has its own vocabulary of sounds, but this one spoke in threats. The first week passed in a haze of unpacking and denial. We explained away the cold spots as poor insulation. The doors that wouldn't stay closed were blamed on uneven floors. The constant feeling of being watched through the conservatory windows was just the unfamiliarity of rural living after years in the city. We became experts at rationalization, architects of our own delusion, but the house was patient. It waited until we'd grown comfortable, until we'd stopped jumping at every creak before it showed us what it really was. The crash came at 3 a.m. on a Thursday. Not the simple sound of something falling, but a cacophony of destruction that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. I jolted awake, my heart hammering against my ribs, and realized the baby monitor was silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence that feels deliberate, manufactured, wrong. I found our son in the hallway. He was lying on his stomach, perfectly still, 15 feet from his crib. The nursery door stood open, though we always closed it. He wasn't crying. That was the worst part. He just lay there, eyes open, staring at something I couldn't see at the end of the hall. When I picked him up, his body was cold, as if he'd been lying on that floor for hours instead of seconds. The nursery was undisturbed. The crib's rails were up, the mobile still gently swaying, though there was no breeze. The window remained locked from the inside. There was no explanation for how a child who couldn't yet climb had ended up in that hallway. No reason for the crash that had woken us. No source for the cold that clung to his pajamas like morning dew. My wife wanted to call someone. The police, a doctor, anyone. But what would we say? That our house had moved our child? That shadows flowed upward and the trees watched us through the glass? We tucked him between us in our bed and lay awake until dawn, listening to the house breathe around us. The conservatory became the heart of our unease. During the day, it should have been beautiful. All that glass and iron, the view of the woodland, the way light filtered through the canopy. But light behaved strangely in that room. It would pool in corners where it shouldn't reach, leave shadows where illumination should be. Sometimes, looking out at the trees, I'd see movement between the trunks. Not animals. I knew what animals looked like. This was something else, something that moved with purpose, but without form. My wife stopped going in there after the second week. She wouldn't say why, just shook her head when I asked. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but I saw her staring at it from the kitchen window, watching it the way you'd watch a sleeping predator. The bedroom door incident happened on a Sunday morning. I was trying to get dressed while my wife fed our son downstairs. Simple, mundane. I reached for the doorknob and it wouldn't turn. Not stuck, held. I could feel the resistance on the other side. The deliberate pressure of something that didn't want me to leave. The handle was cold enough to burn my palm, and when I pulled harder, I swear I felt it pull back. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the resistance vanished. I stumbled backward as the door swung open, revealing an empty hallway. But the air that rushed in was wrong, thick and musty, carrying the smell of earth and decay, as if I'd opened a door to somewhere else entirely. We started sleeping in shifts after that. One of us always awake, always watching, though we never discussed what we were watching for. Our son became clingy, refusing to sleep in his crib, crying whenever we tried to leave him alone. His eyes would track things we couldn't see, following invisible paths across the ceiling, through the walls. The house grew bolder as autumn settled over the woodland. Doors would open themselves, not dramatically but quietly, insidiously, so you'd walk past a room you knew you'd closed and find it gaping like a mouth. Objects migrated when we weren't looking. I'd set down my coffee mug in the living room and find it in the conservatory, still warm, though I hadn't been in there for days. The footsteps started in October. Not the settling sounds we'd grown accustomed to, but deliberate, measured steps above our heads when we were all downstairs. They'd pace the length of the upper hallway, pause at the top of the stairs, then resume. Sometimes they'd stop right above wherever we were sitting, as if something was listening to us through the floor. My wife began documenting everything in a journal, her handwriting growing more erratic with each entry. She'd measure the distance objects had moved, note the times of unexplained sounds, chart patterns I couldn't see. The journal disappeared one night, and we found it the next morning in the conservatory, its pages fanned out like wings, covered in condensation that had somehow formed words. Watching. We told ourselves we'd leave after our son's second birthday. Just a few more months to find another place, to save money, to figure out how to explain to friends and family why we were abandoning a house we'd just bought. But the house heard our plans, or felt them, or simply knew in the way that old places know things. The final night was a Friday in November. The trees had dropped their leaves, leaving skeletal fingers to tap against the conservatory glass. We'd gone to bed early, exhausted from another sleepless week, our son wedged between us like a talisman. I woke to the sound of running. Not footsteps, running. Full sprint, from one end of the upper floor to the other, back and forth, back and forth. The ceiling shook with the impact. Our son started crying, a thin, terrified wail that barely penetrated the chaos above. Then the doors began. Every door in the house, cupboards, closets, rooms, slamming open and closed in a rhythm that made no sense, a percussion of violence that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. The running continued above, joined now by what sounded like furniture being dragged, thrown, destroyed. But the worst part was the arguing. Voices, muffled but unmistakably angry, rose from the conservatory. A man and a woman, their words indistinct but their fury palpable. The woman screamed, not in fear but in rage, and something glass shattered. The man's voice rose to match, then surpassed, becoming something barely human in its intensity. We huddled in our bed, paralyzed, as the house tore itself apart around us. The arguing grew louder, more violent, punctuated by crashes and thuds that shook the entire structure. Our son had stopped crying, his eyes wide and glassy, staring at the ceiling as if he could see through it. Then, silence. Complete. Absolute silence that pressed against our eardrums like deep water. We lay there for hours, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. When dawn finally came, seeping through the curtains like a blessing, we found the house undisturbed. Every door closed, every piece of furniture in place. Only the conservatory showed signs of what had happened. A single pane of glass, cracked in a spiderweb pattern that looked almost like a face if you tilted your head just right. We left that morning with whatever we could fit in the car. No explanations, no forwarding address, no looking back. The real estate agent didn't seem surprised when we called to list it again. Her voice held that same relief I'd heard in her eyes, mixed now with something else, pity, maybe, or understanding. I drive by sometimes, though my wife doesn't know. The house is still there, still for sale, the sign in the yard faded and tilting. The conservatory glass has all been replaced, gleaming like new teeth. But I've seen people viewing it. Young couples with children, their faces bright with possibility. I should warn them. I should tell them about the shadows that flow upward, the doors that hold themselves closed, the voices that argue in empty rooms. But I know they wouldn't believe me. No one ever believes until they're living it, until they're lying awake at 3 a.m., wondering if madness might be preferable to the alternative. Because here's what I've never told my wife, what I've never told anyone. On that last night, during the arguing, I recognized one of the voices. Just for a moment, just a single word, but it was enough. The man screaming in the conservatory. He sounded exactly like me. And sometimes when I drive by and see that for sale sign, I wonder if we ever really left at all, or if somewhere, in some version of that house that exists alongside our own, we're still there, arguing, running, slamming doors in an endless loop of fury and fear. The new buyers, whoever they are, will find out soon enough. The house is patient after all. It knows how to wait. And those trees, pressing against the glass, they're always watching, always recording, always remembering what happens in the spaces between the walls, in the shadows that flow upward, in the conservatory where the light pools wrong and voices argue in the dark. We tell ourselves we escaped. We have a new house now, a safe house, a quiet house, Our son doesn't remember, we think. He's too young. But sometimes I catch him staring at corners, tracking something invisible across the ceiling. Sometimes he whispers to empty rooms. And sometimes, late at night, I hear footsteps above our bedroom, in our new house, our safe house, pacing back and forth, as if something followed us home, as if we brought it with us, as if we never really left at all. Story 4. The trailer still creaks the same way it did 30 years ago. I know because I'm lying here at 4 in the morning, same as I did when I was 12, listening to those familiar groans of aluminum siding flexing against the desert wind. El Paso hasn't changed much either. Still that strange borderland where two countries bleed into each other, where the Rio Grande carries more stories than water. I shouldn't have come back. But the old man's funeral demanded it, and here I am, in the same narrow bed, in the same suffocating darkness that shaped my childhood. The luminous hands of the clock mock me. 4:03 a.m. Almost time. It started that summer when the heat pressed down on the trailer park like a flat iron, when the air conditioning wheezed its last breath, and we had to sleep with windows cracked open despite the dust and the sounds that crept in from the desert. I'd wake at this ungodly hour, always precisely at 4:07 a.m., though I never understood why that specific time, to sounds that didn't belong to the natural world. First came the dogs, not barking, but that low, fearful whine that animals make when they sense something fundamentally wrong. The trailer park had plenty of strays, tough creatures that fought over scraps and territory, but at 4:07 a.m., they all became cowards together. Then the coyotes would join in from the distant hills, their usual predatory yipping replaced by something that sounded almost like crying. But it was the silence that came next that really made my skin crawl. Complete, absolute silence, as if the desert itself held its breath. In that vacuum, I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears, could feel the blood pulsing through my temples. The trailer would seem to contract around me, the walls pressing closer. Then she would begin. The first time, I thought it was the wind. The desert plays tricks with sound, carrying voices from impossible distances, distorting them into something unrecognizable. But wind doesn't form words. Wind doesn't sob with such profound grief that it makes your chest ache in sympathy. Wind doesn't call out names of children in Spanish, each one pronounced with the careful devotion of a mother counting her treasures. Mis hijos. Todos mis hijos. The voice would start far away, maybe from the concrete ditch that ran behind the trailer park, a flood control channel that stayed bone dry except during the rare desert downpours. The county had built it after a flash flood in '76 swept away 3 trailers and the families inside them. Now it served as a gathering place for everything the desert didn't want. Broken glass, sun-bleached bones of unknown animals, and apparently, her. I'd pull the thin pillow over my head, but the sound would grow closer, her wails becoming more distinct, more human, more impossible to dismiss as imagination. Sometimes I could hear her feet dragging through the sand and gravel, a rhythmic scraping that matched the labored breathing between her cries. She moved with purpose, searching, always searching. The old-timers in the park called her La Llorona, the weeping woman. Every Mexican kid knows the story. The woman who drowned her children and now wanders waterways for eternity, searching for them, sometimes taking living children to replace what she lost. But the Rio Grande was miles away, and our ditch held nothing but dust and desert detritus. Still, she came. I never told my father. He worked the late shift at the copper refinery and would stumble in around 5 a.m., reeking of sulfur and sweat, too exhausted to notice his son's terror-widened eyes. By then, she would be gone, and the desert would return to its normal soundtrack of wind and distant traffic from I-10. But I knew others heard her too. Mrs. Dominguez from 3 trailers down started leaving glasses of water on her steps at night. "Para los espíritus," she'd mutter when anyone asked. The Hendersons moved away after just 2 months, the wife pale and shaking, refusing to say why. Even tough old Miguel, who claimed he'd fought in 3 wars, though which wars changed depending on how much tequila he'd had. would cross himself when anyone mentioned the sounds from the ditch. Now I'm back, and it's 4:06 a.m., 1 minute left. The trailer feels smaller than I remember, cramped with the detritus of my father's final years. Empty prescription bottles crowd the kitchen counter. Oxygen tanks stand like sentinels in the corner. He died alone here, probably listening to the same sounds that haunted my childhood. The thought makes me sick. The dogs start their whimpering right on schedule. I sit up, middle-aged body protesting, and move to the window. The ditch is still there, a black slash across the moonlit landscape. New houses have sprouted up around the trailer park, cookie-cutter subdivisions with HOAs and sprinkler systems trying to force green grass from desert soil. But the ditch remains, too expensive to fill, too useful during monsoon season to abandon. The coyotes join the chorus. Then comes the silence. My hands shake as I reach for the window latch. I never looked before, never had the courage as a child to peer out and confirm what my ears already knew. But I'm not 12 anymore. I've seen real horrors, war zones, emergency rooms, the slow decay of a parent's mind. Surely I can face whatever trick of acoustics or collective delusion plagued my childhood. The window slides open with a squeal that seems obscenely loud in the silence. Desert air floods in, carrying the scent of creosote and something else. Something damp and wrong, like standing water where no water should exist. Then I hear her. Mis hijos. The voice is exactly as I remember. Raw, desperate, ancient. It rises from the ditch, accompanied by that familiar dragging sound. But now I can see as well as hear, and what I see makes no sense. There's a woman in the ditch. Even from this distance, I can make out her form moving through the concrete channel. She wears something light-colored that flows around her like water, though there's no wind. Her hair is long, dark, streaming behind her as if she's underwater. And she's searching, hands extended, feeling along the walls of the ditch with the careful desperation of the blind. But here's what makes my rational mind rebel. She's not touching the ground. Her feet drag through air, 6 inches above the concrete, and the dress, the hair, they move with a current that doesn't exist, following the physics of a drowned world. I should close the window. I should pack my things and leave. Never return to this place where reality wears thin. But I'm frozen, watching her approach the section of ditch directly behind the trailer. She stops there, in the exact spot where floodwater once carved away earth and lives, and her wailing reaches a crescendo that makes my teeth ache. Todos mis hijos, los perdí todos. All my children, I lost them all. Then she turns and looks directly at me. Her face is wrong, not monstrous, not decayed, just wrong in a way my brain refuses to process. Like looking at a photographic negative or trying to focus on something that exists in more dimensions than human eyes can perceive. Water streams from her eyes, her mouth, her hair. Impossible amounts of water in this desert place, pooling around her floating feet, running upward along the concrete walls in defiance of gravity. She raises one hand toward me, and I understand with terrible clarity that she recognizes me. She's always recognized me, even when I was 12 and hiding under thin blankets. Every night at 4:07 a.m., she knew exactly where I was. My phone rings, shattering the moment. I fumble for it, never taking my eyes off the ditch, but when I glance at the screen and back, she's gone. Just gone, as if she never existed. The dogs have stopped whimpering. A coyote gives a normal yip from the hills. The desert breathes again. The phone shows a missed call from a number I don't recognize, but there's a voicemail. My hands shake as I play it. Hello, this is Desert Vista Hospital. We're trying to reach the next of kin for... There's a rustling of papers. For a patient admitted tonight, male, approximately 60 years old. No identification. He was found wandering near the flood control channel off Mesa Street, completely disoriented. He keeps asking for his son and saying something about 4:07. If this is the wrong number. I hang up and check the time. 4:11 a.m. The ditch is empty now, just concrete and shadow. But there's something different about it. something I couldn't see from my childhood vantage point. From this angle, with the moon at just the right position, I can make out graffiti on the far wall, faded but still visible. Names and dates, the kind of memorial kids spray paint for their dead. But these are old, probably from the 70s. 3 names, 3 dates. All the same day in 1976, the day of the flood. I grab my keys and head for the door, but something makes me stop at my father's room. I never asked him about that night when I was 12, never told him about the sounds. But now I wonder, did he hear them too? Did he lie awake, listening to her search, wondering if the stories were true? On his nightstand, beneath the usual clutter of an old man's life, I find a photograph I've never seen before. It's water damaged, the edges curled and yellow, but I can make out a young woman standing in front of a trailer, this trailer, with 3 small children. The woman is beautiful, with long dark hair and a white sundress. She's smiling, but there's something in her eyes, something desperate and sad. On the back, in my father's shaking handwriting, Maria and the kids, 1976, before the flood. Maria, not my mother's name. My mother left when I was 2, or so my father always said. I never questioned it, never pushed for details. Children accept the realities they're given. The phone rings again. Desert Vista Hospital. This time I answer. The voice on the other end is professional, tired. They found the man around 3 a.m., she says. He was standing in the flood control channel, calling out names, children's names. When they approached him, he said he was looking for his kids, that he'd lost them in the water. He said his son would understand, that his son knew about 407. I tell her I'll be right there and hang up, but I don't move. Not yet. Instead, I stand in my father's room, holding a photograph of a woman I don't recognize with children I never knew existed, and I think about the stories we tell ourselves, about the ghosts we create to explain our guilt, about the difference between supernatural horror and the mundane tragedies that destroy us slowly, over decades. The clock on the nightstand reads 4:23 a.m. In the distance, I hear sirens. They're coming this way. I walk back to my window and look out at the ditch one more time. There's water in it now, just a trickle, but water nonetheless. Impossible in this drought, impossible at this time of year. It glows faintly in the moonlight, flowing uphill, defying every natural law. And in that impossible water, I see reflections that shouldn't exist. 3 small faces looking up at me, mouths open as if calling out, though I hear no sound. They have my father's eyes. They have my eyes. The sirens are getting closer. I close the window and sit on the bed, photograph still in my hand. I'll go to the hospital soon. I'll see whatever's left of my father's mind, though I suspect I already know what I'll find. A man haunted by a tragedy he never spoke about, constructing elaborate delusions to avoid a truth too painful to acknowledge. Unless the sounds were real. Unless she really does walk the ditch at 4:07 a.m., searching for children lost to sudden water in a desert place. Unless my father spent 40 years listening to the woman he couldn't save calling for the children he let die. Unless I've been hearing my sibling's mother my entire life, never knowing who she really was. The photograph is crumbling in my grip. Water damage maybe, or maybe it's the tears I don't remember crying. Outside, the desert is quiet except for the sirens. But I know she'll be back tomorrow at 4:07 a.m. And the next night, and the next. She'll keep searching until she finds what she lost, or until everyone who remembers the truth is gone. I wonder which will come first. The paramedics are at the door now, knocking urgently. They must have traced the call. They think someone here needs help. They're not wrong. But before I answer, I take one last look at the photograph. The woman's face is fading, water damage spreading across the image like spillage from an overturned glass. Soon, she'll be completely gone. Just another ghost story told in trailer parks and border towns. A cautionary tale about watching your children near water. Except there's no water here. There's never been water here. Has there? The knocking becomes pounding. I set the photograph down and move toward the door, but my legs feel strange, heavy, as if I'm walking through water. The clock on the wall reads 4:07, but that can't be right. It was just 4:23. Time doesn't move backward. From the ditch, I hear her calling again. Or maybe it's the sirens. Or maybe it's my father, lost in time and memory, calling for children who may or may not have existed. I open the door, but there's no one there. Just the empty desert and the sound of water that shouldn't exist, flowing through channels that might be concrete or might be memory, carrying voices that could be wind or could be the endless grief of the lost. The trailer creaks around me, and I realize I never left. I'm still 12 years old, listening to sounds I don't understand, afraid to look outside. Or I'm my father, confused and guilty, wandering a dry ditch looking for redemption. Or I'm her, the woman in white, forever searching for what the water took. The only thing I know for certain is that it's 4:07 a.m. in El Paso, Texas, and somewhere in the space between the real and the imagined, between memory and madness, a woman is crying for her children, and maybe, just maybe, one of them is me. Story 5. The mind has a way of protecting us from truths too terrible to accept. Sometimes it builds walls around memories, sealing them away like toxic waste in concrete. But concrete cracks, and what seeps through those cracks has a way of poisoning everything it touches. I was 7 when my mother started leaving me alone in our 4th-floor apartment. Not for long stretches, just an hour here, 90 minutes there, while she ran errands she deemed too tedious to drag a restless child through. The building was old, pre-war construction with walls thick enough to muffle the outside world into a distant hum. Our unit faced another identical building across a narrow alley, the gap between them barely wide enough for sunlight to squeeze through at noon. That summer afternoon started like any other. My mother had left me with strict instructions. Don't answer the door, don't touch the stove, and absolutely do not open the windows. The apartment transformed into a stifling box within minutes of her departure, the air growing thick and syrupy. I remember pressing my face against the cool glass of the living room window, watching my breath fog and fade, creating a rhythm that made the emptiness feel less absolute. That's when I first noticed movement in the window directly across from ours. The other building had always been there, of course, its windows reflecting our lives back at us like dark mirrors. But I'd never seen anyone in that particular unit before. The curtains were always drawn, the glass always black. Yet there she was, a girl, perhaps 9 or 10, with hair so pale it seemed to glow against the darkness behind her. She waved. I waved back instinctively, the way children do when they recognize another member of their tribe. She pressed both hands against her window and leaned forward, her breath creating twin clouds on the glass. I could see her mouth moving, forming words I couldn't hear across the gap between our buildings. She pointed at me, then at herself, then made a gesture I understood immediately. She wanted to play. I shook my head and pointed at my closed window, mouthing the word, locked. My mother had installed special latches after I'd once leaned too far out trying to retrieve a dropped toy. The girl tilted her head, studying me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. Then she smiled, a wide, eager smile that stretched further than seemed comfortable, and began gesturing more animatedly. She pointed at her window, then mimed pushing it up. Her window was open. Then she pointed at mine, making the same motion. When I shook my head again, she held up one finger, wait, and disappeared from view. Moments later, she returned holding something, a piece of paper. She pressed it against the glass, and even across the alley, I could make out the large, careful letters, "Play with me." I found paper and a marker, wrote back, "Can't. Locked in." Her response came quickly, "I know a way." The air in the apartment seemed to grow thicker, pressing against my eardrums. Sweat trickled down my spine as I watched her write another message. "Open your window." I wrote, "It's locked." She shook her head, that strange smile returning. New message, "Try." Something about the way she held my gaze made me reach for the latch. My fingers found the mechanism, the one my mother checked every morning, the one that required a key I didn't have. But as my hand touched the metal, I heard a soft click. The latch fell open. The window was suddenly, impossibly, unlocked. I should have been afraid. Some primitive part of my brain was screaming warnings, but curiosity is a powerful drug for a lonely child. I pushed the window up, just a few inches, and immediately heard her voice carried on the stifling summer air. Finally, I've been waiting so long for someone to play with. Her voice was strange, not quite wrong, but not quite right either, like a recording played at slightly the wrong speed. "I'm not supposed to open the window," I called back, guilt already gnawing at my stomach. "But you did," she said, and giggled. The sound raised goosebumps along my arms despite the heat. "Come on, come play with me. It's easy." "I can't leave. My mom will be back soon." "Not that soon," she said, and something about the certainty in her voice made my mouth go dry. She leaned further out her window, and I noticed her movements had an odd quality to them, as if she were underwater, or as if the air around her were thicker than it should be. "Watch me. Just do what I do." Before I could respond, she climbed onto her windowsill. My heart hammered against my ribs as she stood up, balancing on the narrow ledge 4 stories above the alley. Her nightgown, and why was she wearing a nightgown in the afternoon, fluttered in a breeze I couldn't feel. "Don't!" I shouted, but she just laughed again, that sound like broken wind chimes. "It's easy," she said. "Just jump across. I do it all the time. Watch." She crouched, preparing to leap across the alley to my window. The gap had to be at least 8 feet. No child could make that jump. No human could make that jump from a standing position on a narrow ledge. But she was already moving, already launching herself into the air with impossible grace. Time dilated. I watched her soar across the gap, her pale hair streaming behind her, her arms outstretched toward my window. Her face was rapturous, lit with a joy so intense it looked almost painful. For a moment, she seemed to hang suspended in the air, neither rising nor falling, as if the laws of physics were merely suggestions she could ignore. She landed on my windowsill with barely a sound, perched there like a bird, her face inches from mine with only the mosquito screen between us. Up close, I could see things I hadn't noticed from across the alley. Her skin had a translucent quality, like wax paper held up to light. Underneath, I could see something moving. Not veins, but something else. Something that shifted and writhed when she smiled. Her eyes were the color of deep water, but the pupils were wrong. They dilated and contracted independently of each other, as if each eye were looking at something different. "See?" and she whispered, and her breath smelled like empty rooms, like dust and absence. "Easy. Now you try. Jump to my window and we can play in my apartment. I have so many toys, so many games." I can't jump that far." Her smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed to go back too far into her mouth. "Sure you can. You just have to believe. You just have to want it enough. Don't you want to play with me?" There was something hypnotic about her voice, something that made the impossible seem reasonable. I found myself pushing the window higher, found myself climbing onto the sill. The alley yawned below, a canyon of shadows and dumpsters and things that skittered in the dark. But I wasn't looking down. I was looking at her window, at the darkness beyond it that seemed to pulse with promise. "That's it," she crooned, backing away from my window, preparing to jump back to hers. "Just follow me. Just do what I do. It's like flying." She leaped again, that impossible leap, and landed in her window frame. She turned back to me, beckoning with both hands. The darkness behind her seemed to reach out too, tendrils of shadow that might have been curtains, or might have been something else entirely. I crouched on my windowsill, muscles tensing, mind emptying of everything but the target window. The rational part of my brain had gone silent, overridden by something older, something that responded to her voice like a fish to a lure. I was going to jump. I knew, with absolute certainty, that I was going to jump. The front door slammed open behind me. My mother's scream shattered whatever spell had been woven around me. Her hands yanked me backward with such force that we both tumbled onto the living room floor. I heard the window slam shut, heard the lock click back into place, though neither of us had touched it. My mother was sobbing, holding me so tight I could barely breathe, repeating my name over and over like a prayer or an incantation. When she finally calmed enough to speak coherently, she grabbed my face between her hands, searching my eyes for something I didn't understand. What were you doing? What in God's name were you doing? I told her about the girl, about the window, about the jump. The color drained from her face with each word. She dragged me to the window, pointed at the building across the alley. Which window? Show me which window. I pointed, but even as I did, I felt confusion creeping in. The window was dark again, the curtains drawn. No sign of the girl, no sign of life at all. There's no one there, my mother said, her voice shaking. That apartment has been empty for 2 years. A girl did live there, but... She never finished that sentence, but I learned the truth years later, digging through old newspapers at the library. A girl had lived in that apartment. She'd been 9 years old, left alone too often, lonely and desperate for attention. One summer afternoon, she'd tried to jump from her window to another building's fire escape. She hadn't made it, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what I found in the police report. She'd been trying to jump to our building, to our apartment specifically. The previous tenant had reported seeing her on the windowsill just before she fell, claimed she'd been calling out to someone, beckoning to someone. But the apartment, our apartment, had been empty that day, or so everyone thought. I'm 32 now, and I still live in the city, though nowhere near that old building. I have my own children, and I've never once left them alone. Not because I fear they'll open windows or talk to strangers, but because I fear what might be waiting for them when they're vulnerable, when they're lonely, when their defenses are down. Sometimes, on summer afternoons when the air grows thick and oppressive, I catch glimpses of her in reflections, in shop windows, in puddles, in the dark glass of my phone when it's turned off. She hasn't aged a day. She's still standing on that windowsill, still smiling that too wide smile, still beckoning, still waiting for me to jump. The thing is, I've never been sure what really happened that day. Did my mother save me from a fatal fall, my mind conjuring a ghostly explanation for my inexplicable behavior? Or did she pull me back from something worse than death, from following a lonely spirit into whatever dark realm she inhabits? The uncertainty is its own kind of torment. Because if she was real, if she's still there, still waiting, then she's not just waiting for me anymore. She's waiting for any child left alone, any child whose loneliness opens a door that should remain closed. I've gone back to the old building once, just once in daylight with plenty of people around. The window is still dark, still curtained, but as I turned to leave, I could have sworn I saw movement behind the glass. A small hand pressed against the window. A message written in fog on the glass from the inside. Still want to play? I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I ran and didn't look back. But sometimes on nights when sleep won't come, I wonder what would have happened if my mother had been just a few seconds later. Would I have made the jump? Could I have made it, carried by whatever force carried her? Or would I have fallen, become another newspaper story, another warning about leaving children unattended? Or would something else have happened? Something worse? The not knowing is what haunts me most. That, and the certainty that somewhere, in some building, in some city, she's still there. Still waiting by a window. Still looking for someone lonely enough, young enough, desperate enough to believe that impossible leaps are possible. Still promising that it's easy. Just jump like me. Story 6. The listing had been too good to pass up. A 2-bedroom flat in North London for half the going rate. The estate agent mentioned something about the building's history as we signed the papers, her words tumbling out quickly as if she wanted to discharge an obligation without dwelling on details. Used to be part of St. Edmund's, she'd said, shuffling papers. The old mental health facility. All converted now, of course. Lovely period features. My housemate and I had exchanged glances, shrugged. We were both pushing 30, working jobs that barely covered London rent. History was just that. History. The first 3 weeks passed without incident. The flat was spacious, with high ceilings that made our voices echo slightly, and tall windows that let in wan northern light. The walls were freshly painted white, but underneath, if you looked closely in certain angles of light, you could see the ghosts of old institutional green bleeding through. The floors were original hardwood, scarred in places where heavy equipment might have stood. Beds, perhaps, or restraint chairs. I tried not to think about it. It started with the footsteps. I'd been lying in bed, laptop balanced on my chest, when I heard them. Slow, deliberate, shuffling along the hallway outside my room. Not my housemate's quick, purposeful stride. These were different, measured. Each step seemed to take an eternity, as if whoever was walking had all the time in the world, or perhaps no sense of time at all. I muted my video, listened. The footsteps continued their leisurely pace toward the living room, then stopped. I waited for the sound of the bathroom door, the kitchen tap, anything that would indicate normal late-night activity. Nothing. The next morning I mentioned it casually over coffee. My housemate looked up from his phone, dark circles under his eyes. "You heard them too?" His voice was carefully neutral, but I caught the relief in it, the same relief I felt knowing I wasn't alone in this. "Around 2? 2:15, he corrected. I checked my phone. We didn't discuss it further, but something shifted between us. We became conspirators in our attention, both of us listening for sounds that shouldn't be there, exchanging meaningful looks when the flat settled in ways that felt too deliberate to be mere building noise. The lamp incident happened a week later. I'd been explicit about turning it off before leaving for work. I remembered the click of the switch, the sudden dimness of my bedroom. But when I returned that evening, it blazed cheerfully beside my bed. My housemate had been at his office all day. He had the keycard records to prove it. The letting agency confirmed no maintenance had been scheduled. I unscrewed the bulb that night, placed it in my drawer. The next evening, the lamp was on again. Bulb somehow back in place, glowing with what felt like smug persistence. We stopped talking about the incidents entirely after that, as if acknowledging them might give them more power. But I could see the strain in my housemate's face, the way he'd taken to wearing headphones constantly, creating a buffer of sound between himself and whatever shared our space. The building's history became an obsession. Late nights found me scrolling through archived newspapers, medical journals, anything that might explain what St. Edmund's had been. The fragments I found were frustratingly vague, references to innovative treatments, unfortunate incidents, closure pending investigation. One article from 1987 mentioned a patient who'd insisted the walls were listening, who'd spent hours knocking on them in elaborate patterns, trying to communicate with whatever he believed lived inside the plaster and brick. 3 months in, the physical manifestations began. I'd been sitting on our worn sofa, nursing a beer and trying to focus on some mindless streaming show, when movement caught my peripheral vision. The throw pillow, one of those decorative things left by the previous tenants, lifted from the opposite end of the sofa. Not dramatically, not violently, but with deliberate purpose, as if invisible hands had gripped it carefully, considerately. Time stretched. The pillow arced through the air with almost balletic grace, rotating slowly. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, could only watch as it completed its journey, landing squarely on my beer bottle with a soft thump. The bottle tipped. Beer spread across the coffee table, dripping onto the scarred hardwood with a rhythmic patter that sounded almost like laughter. I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt a strange, hollow sensation, as if something inside me had recognized something outside me, and neither of us liked what we saw. The knock came that same night. I'd been lying in bed, every muscle tense, replaying the pillow incident and trying to rationalize it. Muscle spasm, hallucination, carbon monoxide leak, anything but what it had appeared to be. The flat was silent except for the usual building sounds, pipes ticking, distant traffic, the occasional creak of settling wood. Then, A single knock on my bedroom door. Not tentative, not aggressive, intelligent, deliberate. The door was hollow core, and the sound reverberated through it like a drumbeat. I waited, not breathing. Waited for a second knock, for the handle to turn, for my housemate's voice asking if I was awake. Nothing came, just that single announcement of presence, as if something wanted me to know it was there, had always been there, would always be there. The next morning I found my housemate in the kitchen, packing boxes. We didn't need to discuss it. The decision had been made by something beyond conscious thought, some primitive part of our brains that recognized a threat our rational minds couldn't quite process. As I packed my own belongings, I found myself studying the walls more carefully. In my bedroom, near the window, there were scratches in the paint I hadn't noticed before. Not random, too regular for that. They might have been tally marks, or perhaps letters in some alphabet I didn't recognize, or they might have been nothing at all, just normal wear and tear that my increasingly fractured perception was organizing into patterns. The letting agency didn't argue when we broke the lease. The woman who processed our paperwork had the same quick, dismissive manner as the estate agent who'd rented us the flat. "These conversions can be challenging," she said, not meeting our eyes. "The building has personality." On our last night, as I did a final check of my emptied room, I found something that made my skin prickle with recognition. Pressed into the soft wood of the window frame, barely visible unless you knew to look, were words carved in shaky letters. They never left. Below that, in what looked like fresher marks, "We never left." And below that, in handwriting I recognized with cold certainty as my own, though I had no memory of writing it, "I never left." I ran my fingers over the words, feeling the grooves in the wood. They were real. The question was whether I was. The footsteps started again as I stood there, that same measured pace, coming down the hallway toward my room. But this time, I realized something that made my chest tighten with a fear deeper than anything I'd felt before. The footsteps weren't coming from outside my door. They were coming from inside the room, moving away from where I stood, as if I was the one walking, had always been the one walking, would always be the one walking through these halls that had seen so much confusion between what was real and what was believed. I left without looking back, but sometimes, in my new flat, in the small hours when London grows quiet, I hear those footsteps again, slow, measured, patient, and I wonder if I ever really left that converted ward, or if part of me is still there, shuffling through the hallways, turning on bedside lamps, moving pillows with careful, deliberate purpose, knocking on doors to let the living know that the boundaries between then and now, between them and us, between sane and otherwise, are thinner than the hollow core doors that separate our carefully maintained realities. The building still stands in North London, still advertised at half the market rate. Sometimes I check the listings, read the new descriptions that never mention its history. Charming period conversion, they say. Unique character. Must be seen to be appreciated. They're right about that last part. Some things must be experienced to be believed, and once believed, can never quite be forgotten, or escaped, or proven to have ended. The footsteps continue, somewhere, somewhen, walking through spaces that exist in the corners of perception where the paint bleeds through, and the walls remember everything they've witnessed, everything they've absorbed, everything they've become. I never went back to check if those words were really carved in the window frame. I tell myself it's because I don't need to, because I know what I saw, what I felt, what I experienced. But sometimes, in the moments between sleep and waking, I wonder if I'm afraid of what I might find, or worse, afraid of what might find me, waiting there in that room where the boundaries dissolved and something that had been watching, listening, recording, finally decided to reach out and leave its mark, or perhaps help me leave mine. Story 7. The house had been in our family for exactly 100 years when I finally moved back in. My sister had called me 3 months earlier, her voice strained in that particular way that meant she was trying not to sound desperate. She needed help with Mom, she said. The old house was too much for them to handle alone. But there was something else in her voice, something she wasn't saying, that made me pack up my apartment in the city and drive the 7 hours back to the place I'd sworn I'd never return to. The first night back, I understood what my sister hadn't been able to tell me over the phone. I was unpacking boxes in what had been my childhood bedroom, now converted into a guest room with aggressively neutral beige walls, when I heard it. A crash so violent that the floorboards beneath my feet vibrated. It came from directly above me, from my sister's old room that had been empty since she'd moved into the converted attic years ago. The sound was massive, apocalyptic, like someone had dropped a refrigerator from the ceiling. I stood frozen, box cutter still in my hand, waiting. The house settled back into its century-old silence, that particular quiet that only old houses possess, a silence that feels like held breath. My mother was downstairs watching television, the blue light flickering through the doorway. My sister was at her night shift at the hospital. There was no one else in the house. I climbed the narrow stairs slowly, each step announcing my presence with a groan that seemed to echo through the walls themselves. The hallway stretched before me, lit only by the weak moonlight filtering through the lace curtains my grandmother had hung decades ago. My sister's old room stood at the end, door slightly ajar, darkness pooling beyond the threshold like spilled ink. The room was empty, not just unoccupied, empty. No furniture, no boxes, nothing that could have fallen, just bare floorboards covered in a thin layer of dust that my footprints disturbed, creating small clouds that hung in the air like accusations. The ceiling showed no damage, no signs of impact. The windows were intact, sealed shut with old paint and years of neglect. I stood there for a long time, trying to rationalize what I'd heard. Old houses settle, pipes knock, wood expands and contracts. But this hadn't been any of those things. This had been deliberate, forceful, intentional. When I finally went back downstairs, my mother was standing at the bottom of the stairs, her face pale in the television's glow. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, part relief, part something else. "You heard it too," she said. It wasn't a question. The crashes became a regular occurrence after that, always from the same room, always when no one was up there. Sometimes during dinner, causing us all to freeze mid-conversation, forks halfway to our mouths. Sometimes in the deep of night, jolting me awake with my heart hammering against my ribs. My mother and sister had developed a practiced way of ignoring them, of continuing whatever they were doing as if nothing had happened. But I could see the tension in their shoulders, the way their eyes would flick upward for just a moment before returning to their tasks. It was 2 weeks before I saw him. I was in the living room, controller in my hands, deeply absorbed in a game I'd been using to avoid thinking about the sounds upstairs. The television screen was dark during a loading sequence, and in that brief moment of blackness, I saw a reflection that shouldn't have been there. A figure standing directly behind my chair, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing clothes that seemed to belong to another era. A cardigan sweater, pressed trousers, the kind of outfit I'd only seen in old photographs. I spun around so fast the controller flew from my hands, but the space behind me was empty. Just the familiar living room with its outdated wallpaper and the grandfather clock that hadn't worked since before I was born. But the air felt different, charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm. And there was a smell, faint but unmistakable. Pipe tobacco, and that particular aftershave that had been discontinued in the 70s. My grandfather's aftershave. I'd never met the man. He died 3 years before I was born, but his presence had always lingered in the house like smoke and fabric. His study remained untouched on the second floor, his clothes still hung in the master bedroom closet, his reading glasses still sat on the kitchen windowsill where he'd left them the morning of his heart attack. The sightings became more frequent, always in reflections, windows, mirrors, the black screen of my laptop, always behind me, always watching. Sometimes I could make out details, the sharp line of his jaw that I recognized from family photos, the way he stood with his hands clasped behind his back, the slight tilt of his head as if he was listening to something only he could hear. My sister found me one night sitting in the dark kitchen, staring at the kettle's polished surface. How long have you been seeing him? I asked without preamble. She pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, her scrubs rustling in the darkness. We didn't need to specify who him was. Since I was 15, she admitted. Mom's been seeing him for longer. The footsteps started the next day. They would begin at the old front door, the one we never used anymore. The one that had been sealed shut after years of warping made it impossible to open properly. Heavy, measured steps would cross the foyer, pause at the bottom of the stairs, then continue up. Sometimes they were accompanied by humming. A woman's voice, sweet and low, humming melodies I didn't recognize but that made something deep in my chest ache with inexplicable longing. The door would latch itself after these visits. We'd hear the distinctive click of the old brass lock, the one that required a skeleton key we'd lost decades ago. But when we'd check, the door would still be sealed, painted shut, immovable. My mother's behavior grew increasingly erratic. I'd find her in random rooms, having conversations with empty air. She'd set extra places at the dinner table, then look confused when I asked who was coming. Once, I woke at 3 a.m. to find her standing in my doorway, silhouetted against the hallway light. "He wants to tell you something," she whispered, her voice not quite her own. "He's been waiting so long to tell you something." She had no memory of it the next morning. The house itself seemed to be changing. Or maybe I was just noticing things that had always been there. Doors that led to rooms with dimensions that didn't quite match the exterior. Shadows that fell at impossible angles. The way sound traveled strangely through the walls, carrying conversations from rooms that should have been empty. I started keeping a journal, trying to track the occurrences, looking for patterns. But when I'd go back to read previous entries, they weren't what I remembered writing. The handwriting was mine, but the words were different. They spoke of conversations I didn't remember having, of seeing things I couldn't recall. One entry, dated 3 days before I'd even started the journal, simply read, "He's not the only one who never left." My sister moved out abruptly one Tuesday morning, packed her things while I was at the grocery store, and left only a note. "I can't anymore. I'm sorry." That night, alone with my mother in the house, I heard the crashes again. But this time, they weren't from my sister's old room. They were from mine. I was lying in bed and the sound came from directly above me, from inside my own ceiling. The plaster cracked, thin lines spreading like veins across the white surface. Something dark began to seep through. Not water, not blood, but something that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I found myself in the hallway without remembering having gotten out of bed. My mother was there too, standing at the top of the stairs in her nightgown, her hair wild around her face. She was staring at something behind me, her mouth moving in silent words. I turned around slowly, my body feeling like it was moving through thick water. The figure was there, solid this time, not just a reflection. My grandfather, exactly as he appeared in the photographs, down to the small stain on his cardigan that my grandmother had always complained about. But his eyes were wrong. They were too deep, too dark, like looking into an empty house through its windows. He opened his mouth, and the humming began. Not from him, but from everywhere. The walls, the floors, the air itself. A woman's voice, surrounding us, caressing us, pulling us forward. My mother began to walk toward him, her arms outstretched like a child reaching for comfort. "Mom," I tried to say, but my voice came out wrong. Older, raspier, like I'd been smoking for 40 years, like his voice, from the recordings I'd heard. "Mom, stop." She turned to look at me, and her face was younger, so much younger, but her eyes were ancient. "He's been waiting," she said in that voice that wasn't quite hers. "We've all been waiting. The house keeps us, you see. It keeps us, and we keep it, and round we go." The humming grew louder, and I recognized the tune now. It was the lullaby my mother used to sing to us, but in reverse, the notes flowing backward through time. The figure that looked like my grandfather raised his hand, and I saw that his fingers were too long, extending back into the shadows like roots into soil. I ran, down the stairs, through the kitchen, to the old front door that had been sealed for years. It opened at my touch, swinging wide on hinges that screamed like living things. Behind me, I could hear my mother laughing, or crying, or both. I stood on the porch, looking back at the house that had sheltered 4 generations of my family. Every window was lit, shadows moving behind the curtains in a dance I didn't want to understand. The crashes continued, rhythmic now, like a heartbeat, like footsteps, like something trying to break through from somewhere else, or maybe trying to break in. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from my sister. "Did you really think you could leave?" I looked down at my hands. They were older, spotted with age, trembling with a palsy I didn't have. In the black screen of my phone, I saw my reflection clearly for the first time in weeks. It wasn't my face. Or maybe it was. Maybe it had always been. The house keeps us after all, and we keep it, and round we go. I walked back inside, closing the door behind me. It latched itself with that familiar click, the sound of coming home, the sound of never leaving. Upstairs, my mother had stopped laughing. The humming had ceased, but the footsteps continued, measured and patient, walking the same paths they'd walked for 100 years. In my sister's old room, something crashed again, and this time I understood. It wasn't something falling. It was something trying to stand up. Something that had been lying down for a very long time, waiting for the right moment, waiting for all of us to be home again. I climbed the stairs to meet it, my footsteps matching the rhythm perfectly, because of course they did. They always had. In a 100-year-old house, everything eventually learns the dance. The last thing I wrote in my journal, or maybe the first thing, or maybe something I'm writing right now. There are no ghosts here. There never were. There's only the house, and those of us who've agreed to be haunted. But even as I write this, I can hear him behind me, breathing with lungs that stopped working before I was born. And somewhere in the walls, a woman hums a lullaby in reverse, calling us all back home, back to the beginning, back to the house that keeps us. Round and round we go. Story 8. The darkness in my mother's living room had weight that night, pressing against my chest like wet wool. I'd been sleeping there for 3 days, ever since Mom converted her guest bedroom into a makeshift office for her real estate business. My younger brother sprawled on the other couch, his breathing shallow and regular. Outside, November wind scraped branches against the windows with skeletal fingers. I couldn't say what woke me. Maybe it was the sudden stillness, that peculiar vacuum when even the house stops settling, when the refrigerator's hum dies mid-cycle. My eyes opened to absolute blackness. The digital clock on the cable box should have glowed green, but there was nothing. Power outage, I thought, though the neighbor's porch light still leaked through the curtains. Then I heard it. The breathing started soft, almost imperceptible, like wind through a crack in the wall. But wind doesn't have rhythm. Wind doesn't pause between inhales and exhales. This breathing filled the room with deliberate presence, each breath deeper and more labored than the last. "You hearing this?" I whispered. My brother's silhouette shifted. "Yeah." We lay frozen, 2 grown men reduced to children afraid of the dark. The breathing grew louder, raspier, as if whoever, whatever, was making it struggled for each gulp of air. It came from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding us like we'd been submerged in someone else's lungs. The sound was familiar in the worst way. It reminded me of hospital rooms, of machines forcing air into failing bodies, of the wet rattle that precedes. No. I pushed the thought away. My brother's hand found mine in the darkness, his palm slick with sweat. We hadn't held hands since we were kids, since Dad left and Mom worked nights and we'd huddle together during thunderstorms. But here we were, 31 and 28, clutching each other while invisible lungs worked overtime in our mother's living room. The breathing intensified. Each inhale seemed to pull the air from my own chest. Each exhale pushed heat against my face despite the November chill. The room smelled wrong. Antiseptic and sweet decay, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. like a hospital, like dying. I tried to speak, to break whatever spell held us, but my throat constricted. The breathing entity moved closer, or maybe we were sinking deeper into it. The couch cushions compressed as if someone sat between us, though no one was there. The breathing became intimate, personal, like a whispered secret meant only for us. My aunt had been dying for months. Cancer, the kind that starts quiet and ends loud. She'd been my father's sister, but she'd chosen us in the divorce, showing up for birthdays and graduations when he couldn't be bothered. Last I'd heard, she was in hospice 2 states away, her daughters maintaining a bedside vigil. The breathing hitched, stuttered, stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. It stretched taut, a held breath waiting to break. My brother's grip tightened until my fingers went numb. We waited for something, a whisper, a touch, a sign that we hadn't imagined at all. The phone rang. The shrill electronic chirp shattered the quiet like a brick through glass. We both jerked, our hands separating as if caught doing something shameful. The phone rang again, and again, insistent in its normalcy. I stumbled toward the kitchen, muscle memory guiding me through the dark. My hand found the receiver on the 4th ring. "Hello?" My voice came out strangled. My cousin's voice, thick with tears. "She's gone. Just now. She asked for you boys at the end." The receiver slipped from my hand, clattering against the linoleum. Through the kitchen doorway, I saw my brother's silhouette still frozen on the couch, waiting for news we both already knew. That was 3 years ago. We never talked about it afterward, my brother and I. Not directly. But sometimes I catch him staring at empty spaces, head tilted like he's listening for something. Sometimes I wake to the sound of breathing that isn't mine, isn't anyone's, and I wonder if she ever really left. The truth is, I've heard it again. Not just that night, but others. Moments when reality feels thin, when the barrier between here and elsewhere turns permeable. It started a month after the funeral. I was alone in my apartment, reading, when the air grew thick with that familiar antiseptic sweetness. The breathing began soft, built to that terrible crescendo, then stopped. No phone call followed, no death announcement, just silence and the certainty that I was being visited. My brother finally broke our unspoken pact last Christmas. Mom was in the kitchen preparing dinner when he pulled me aside. "Do you still hear her?" I didn't need to ask what he meant. "Sometimes." "Me too." He looked older than his 31 years, dark circles, permanent fixtures beneath his eyes. I researched it. Auditory hallucinations, grief manifestation, shared psychotic episodes. "Is that what you think it was?" He was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. I think she was saying goodbye. But I also think maybe goodbye doesn't mean what we thought it meant. I knew what he was trying not to say. That perhaps death isn't a departure, but a relocation. That maybe the breathing we heard wasn't her leaving, but her arriving somewhere new, somewhere parallel to our own existence. A place from which she could still reach out, still visit, still breathe in our presence. The breathing comes more frequently now. Sometimes in my mother's living room when I visit. Sometimes in my own bedroom at 3 a.m. Sometimes in broad daylight when I'm alone in my car, stopped at a red light. It's always the same, labored, desperate, intimate. It builds and stops, like a message in Morse code I can't decode. My brother thinks we're losing our minds, succumbing to some shared delusion born from that night. He started seeing a therapist, taking pills that make him sleep without dreams. He says the breathing has stopped for him. He's lying. I know because I've watched him during family dinners, seen his eyes track something invisible moving through the room. I've noticed how he holds his breath when the air grows thick, how his knuckles white when gripping his fork. The pills haven't stopped anything. They've just taught him to pretend better. As for me, I've stopped trying to rationalize it. Whether it's her ghost, our grief, or some fracture in reality itself doesn't matter anymore. What matters is the message I'm starting to understand, the pattern emerging from those desperate gasps. She's not saying goodbye. She's saying hurry. Hurry because the breathing is getting stronger, more insistent, more alive. Hurry because each visit leaves something behind, a residue that accumulates like dust in corners we can't reach. Hurry because my brother's pills aren't working, and my mother has started hearing it too, though she won't admit it. Last night, the breathing lasted for hours. It filled my apartment until the walls seemed to expand and contract like lung tissue. When it finally stopped, I found condensation on every window, every mirror, as if something had been pressing against the glass from inside, trying to fog its way through. My brother called an hour later, his voice shaking. "Did you?" "Yeah." It was different this time. He was right. The breathing had changed, evolved. It no longer sounded like one person gasping for air. It sounded like dozens, maybe hundreds, all breathing in unison, all struggling with the same desperate rhythm. "Maybe we should," he started, but I cut him off. "Should what? Tell someone? Check ourselves in? Take more pills?" Silence stretched between us, filled with everything we couldn't say. The truth is, I think we've been marked. That night in Mom's living room, when we held hands in the dark and listened to our aunt's last breaths echo across impossible distances, something noticed us noticing. Something recognized us as witnesses, as conductors, as doors left slightly ajar. The breathing will come again tonight. I can feel it building in the air pressure, in the way shadows fall wrong, in the persistent smell of antiseptic and decay that no amount of air freshener can mask. My brother will hear it too, alone in his apartment, fighting the useless protection of his medications. My mother will hear it and pretend she doesn't, turning up the television, drowning out what she can't explain. And somewhere, in whatever space exists between breathing and not breathing, between living and not living, my aunt continues her endless respiration. Not a goodbye, not a hello, but something else entirely. A reminder that the boundaries we believe in, between life and death, between here and there, between sane and insane, are thinner than we imagine. The breathing is starting again now, as I write this. Soft at first, then building. My laptop screen flickers with each exhale. The keys are wet with condensation that isn't from my fingers. I should be terrified. I should run, call someone, do something. Instead, I listen. I breathe along with it, matching rhythm for rhythm, accepting what my brother still fights against. Because I finally understand what she's been trying to tell us all along. The breathing never really stops. We just sometimes forget to listen. And in forgetting, we lose something essential, some connection to the spaces between heartbeats, to the pause between inhale and exhale where everything and nothing exists simultaneously. My aunt found that space in her dying moment and decided to stay there, suspended forever in that eternal breath, reaching out to those who witnessed her transition. Or maybe we're simply losing our minds, my brother and I, our grief manifesting as shared auditory hallucinations that grow stronger with each passing year. Maybe the condensation is from the heating system. Maybe the breathing is wind through invisible cracks. Maybe everything has a rational explanation we're too broken to see, but I don't think so. Because last week I found a voicemail on my phone. Static mostly, but underneath it, unmistakable, the sound of breathing, labored and desperate. The caller ID showed my aunt's old number, the one disconnected 3 years ago. My brother got the same message. So did my mother, though she deleted it immediately, her face pale as chalk. We're all hearing it now. All of us who loved her, all of us who carry pieces of her memory like shrapnel in our hearts. The breathing follows us, grows stronger, multiplies. It's spreading through our family like a virus of sound, a contagion of impossible respiration. And the worst part, the part that keeps me awake, listening, waiting. Sometimes when the breathing is at its loudest, when it fills every corner of whatever room I'm in, I can almost hear something else underneath it. Words maybe, or names, or warnings, or invitations. The breathing continues as I type these final words, surrounding me, embracing me, becoming me. I no longer know where it ends, and I begin. Maybe that's the point. Maybe that's what she's been trying to show us all along. That the last breath isn't really the last. It's just the beginning of a different kind of breathing altogether. Story 9. The knocking started at 11:47 p.m. 3 measured raps against the front door, deliberate and hollow, like knuckles on a coffin lid. I lay in bed, my 17-year-old body rigid beneath the covers, waiting for my parents to stir in their room down the hall. Nothing. The house held its breath with me, every familiar creak and settling sound suddenly conspicuous in its absence. Our Victorian home had stood on Elm Street for over a century, its bones groaning with accumulated history. My parents had bought it cheap after the incident next door, after Mr. Holloway had hanged himself in his attic, leaving behind no note, no explanation, just an empty house that still stood dark against our property line. That was 3 months ago. 3 months of pretending not to notice how the shadows seemed deeper on that side of our yard, how even the neighborhood cats avoided walking past his fence. The knocking came again. Louder. I pulled myself from bed, bare feet touching the cold hardwood floor. The house felt different at night, stretched and distorted like a reflection in disturbed water. Every doorway yawned wider. Every corner harbored deeper darkness. The hallway outside my room extended impossibly far, the bathroom door at its end seeming miles away. Then came the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate thuds ascending our stairs, each one making the old wood cry out in protest. But our stairs were carpeted, had been since we moved in 5 years ago. These footsteps echoed as if striking bare wood, resonating through the house's framework like a tuning fork struck against bone. I crept to my bedroom door, pressing my ear against the painted wood. The footsteps continued their measured ascent. 1, 2, 3. I knew our staircase had 17 steps. I'd counted them countless times as a child, making games of skipping every other one. These footsteps were on step 7 now. 8, 9. My hand found the doorknob, cold as winter iron. The brass seemed to pulse beneath my palm, matching the rhythm of my racing heart. I turned it slowly, wincing at the soft click of the mechanism. The door opened on silent hinges. I'd oiled them just last week, tired of their squeaking. The hallway gaped before me, lit only by the pale moonlight filtering through the window at the far end. The footsteps had stopped at step 13. I knew this because I could feel them waiting there, could sense the weight of something paused mid-ascent, considering its next move. The air in the hallway felt thick, syrupy, like breathing through wet cloth. Each inhalation required conscious effort, my lungs working harder to draw in the strange, dense atmosphere. It tasted of dust and something else, something organic and wrong, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. A tremendous thud shook the entire house. Picture frames rattled on walls. My mother's collection of ceramic birds on the hallway shelf chimed against each other in delicate alarm. The sound had come from above, from the attic we never used, the one my father had sealed after finding evidence of mice. But this was no mouse. Whatever had caused that impact was massive, heavy enough to make the ceiling fixtures sway. Now came the rumbling. It rolled through the walls like distant thunder, starting in the attic and spreading downward through the house's infrastructure. The sound was almost voice-like, a low muttering that seemed to form words just beyond the edge of comprehension. I found myself straining to understand, leaning forward into the hallway despite every instinct screaming at me to retreat. My parents' door remained closed, no light showing beneath it. How could they sleep through this? The rumbling grew louder, more insistent, and now I could almost make out what it was saying. It sounded like a name, repeated over and over, but distorted as if spoken through water or earth. The landing light switch was 10 feet away, mounted on the wall at the top of the stairs. 10 feet through that thick, wrong air. 10 feet toward whatever waited on step 13. My bare feet made no sound on the carpet as I moved forward, each step careful and deliberate. The hallway seemed to stretch as I walked, the distance to the switch growing rather than shrinking. 5 feet now. The rumbling had stopped, replaced by a silence so complete it hurt my ears. 4 feet. I could see the outline of the switch plate, a pale rectangle against the darker wall. 3 feet. The air grew colder with each step, my breath now visible in small puffs of vapor. 2 feet. The presence on the stairs shifted. Not a sound exactly, more a displacement of air, a subtle change in pressure that made my eardrums flex. It was moving again, continuing its ascent. Step 14, 15, 1 foot from the switch. Step 16. My hand shot out, fingers finding the switch and flipping it upward. Light flooded the landing, harsh and sudden after the darkness. He stood on step 17, the final step. Mr. Holloway looked exactly as he had in life. Gray hair neatly combed, wearing his favorite brown cardigan, the one with the leather elbow patches. But something was fundamentally wrong with his presence, as if he existed at a slightly different frequency than the rest of reality. Looking at him was like trying to focus on 2 images superimposed over each other, neither quite solid, both equally real. His eyes met mine, and I waited for the fear to come. Waited for the scream to build in my throat, for my legs to unlock and send me running. But instead, an inexplicable calm washed over me. It was the strangest sensation, like being wrapped in a warm blanket after coming in from the cold, like the feeling of absolute safety I'd had as a small child in my mother's arms. Mr. Holloway's mouth moved, shaping words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. "Not for you," he seemed to say. "Never for you." The lights throughout the house suddenly blazed to life. My parents' door burst open, my mother's scream cutting through the air like breaking glass. She stood in their doorway, face pale, pointing at the figure on the stairs with a trembling hand. My father appeared behind her, pulling her back, his own face a mask of primitive terror. But Mr. Holloway wasn't looking at them. His attention remained fixed on me, and in his dead eyes, I saw something that might have been kindness, or warning, or both. "Get away from him," my father shouted, though whether he was yelling at me or at the apparition I couldn't tell. Mr. Holloway raised one translucent hand, palm facing my parents in what looked like a gesture of warding. They recoiled as if struck, stumbling backward into their room. The door slammed shut with enough force to crack the frame, and then he was gone. Not gradually, not dramatically, simply there one moment and absent the next, leaving only the faintest smell of earth and rain where he'd stood. I remained at the top of the stairs, staring at the empty space, that strange calm still wrapped around me like armor. From behind my parents' door came the sound of frantic whispers, of furniture being dragged across the floor, barricading themselves in. The next morning they wouldn't look at me directly. My mother kept starting sentences she couldn't finish, her hands shaking as she tried to pour coffee. My father made phone calls in hushed tones, turning away whenever I entered the room. Within a week they'd hired a moving company. Within 2 weeks, we were gone. But I knew something they didn't. Something that became clearer with each passing day in our new house, in our new town, miles away from Elm Street and Mr. Holloway's empty home. He hadn't been there to harm us. He'd been there to warn us. Because now, in this new house with its clean walls and no history, I could feel something else settling in. Something that had followed us, patient and hungry. Something that Mr. Holloway had been keeping at bay. It moved in the walls at night, scratching messages I was afraid to decipher. It whispered through the heating vents in voices that weren't quite human. It left wet footprints in the hallway that disappeared by morning, always leading to my door, always stopping just outside. My parents felt it too. I could see it in their increasingly hollow eyes, in the way they jumped at shadows, in how they'd installed new locks on their bedroom door. Locks that faced inward, as if trying to keep something in rather than out. They'd stopped speaking to me altogether now, communicating through notes left on the kitchen counter, never making eye contact, never staying in the same room with me for more than a few moments. Last night, I heard my mother crying through the walls, repeating the same phrase over and over. It should have been him. It should have been him. I wanted to ask her what she meant, wanted to understand what Mr. Holloway had been protecting me from, or perhaps protecting them from through me. But the words wouldn't come. They never did anymore. The scratching in the walls has grown louder these past few days. Sometimes it sounds like fingernails on wood, sometimes like pencil on paper. Last night I pressed my ear to the wall and heard what sounded like my own voice speaking from inside the plaster, reciting names and dates I didn't recognize, describing events I couldn't remember. I've started leaving the lights on at night, all of them, creating an artificial day that never ends. But the shadows still gather in the corners, thick and viscous, and sometimes I catch glimpses of movement in them. Quick, furtive things that shouldn't exist in a well-lit room. There's a pattern to the scratching now, a rhythm, almost like knocking. 3 measured raps, deliberate and hollow, just like that night on Elm Street. Only now I understand that Mr. Holloway hadn't been knocking to get in. He'd been knocking to keep something out. And now that we've left his protection, now that we've run from the guardian who chose to stay even after death, that something has found us. It's patient, it's persistent, and it's growing stronger. Sometimes, late at night when the scratching becomes unbearable, I close my eyes and try to remember the feeling of that inexplicable calm Mr. Holloway brought. I try to summon that sense of being protected, of being chosen for something I don't understand. But all I feel now is the weight of shadows pressing in from all sides, and the terrible certainty that whatever my parents fear in me, whatever made them recoil from their own son, is something I haven't discovered yet. The scratching has stopped. The house is silent except for my breathing and the sound of pencil on paper as I write this. But I know it's not over. It's never over. It's just waiting. And somewhere, perhaps, Mr. Holloway is waiting too. Waiting for us to understand. Waiting for us to return. Waiting to resume his watch. But we won't go back. My parents are too frightened, and I'm too confused, caught between the terror of what might be and the strange comfort of what was. So we stay in this new house with its gathering shadows and its whispers in the walls, pretending that distance can save us from something that was never about location at all. The knocking is starting again, not at the front door this time. It's coming from inside my bedroom wall. 3 measured raps, right behind my headboard. And despite everything, despite the fear and the confusion, and the growing certainty that something fundamental has gone wrong with reality itself, I find myself wanting to knock back, to answer, to invite in whatever waits on the other side. Because maybe that's what Mr. Holloway was trying to tell me all along. Maybe the real horror isn't what knocks at our doors or walks our stairs or stands guard in the shadows. Maybe it's what we become when we refuse to answer. Story 10. The smell hit me first. Not unpleasant exactly, but wrong somehow, like roses left too long in stagnant water. It was my 3rd week at the state forest office, and I'd grown used to the creaking bones of the 250-year-old farmhouse. But that smell always caught me off guard. Sweet decay mixed with something earthier, older. The kind of scent that shouldn't exist in a government building filled with filing cabinets and fluorescent lights. I settled into my desk, trying to ignore how the morning shadows seemed to pool in the corners, despite the overhead lighting. The other staff members had already warned me about the building's quirks. Doors that opened on their own, cold spots that moved through rooms like invisible guests. The occasional sound of boots on the stairs when everyone was accounted for downstairs. They'd laughed about it, calling it character, but their eyes had held something else. A wariness. The same look I'd started seeing in my own reflection. The kitchen cabinets began their morning routine around 10:30. I heard the familiar squeak of hinges from down the hall, followed by the soft thud of wood meeting wood. Once, twice, 3 times. Always 3. I kept typing, fingers steady on the keyboard because acknowledging it somehow made it worse. Made it real. My supervisor had found me standing in the kitchen during my first week, staring at the cabinets as they swung open in perfect synchronization. She'd simply reached past me for her coffee mug and said the building had been many things before it became our office. A family home, a boarding house during the Depression, even a makeshift hospital during the influenza outbreak of 1918. Lives had been lived here. Dreams dreamed, hearts broken. The walls remembered everything she'd said, then walked away before I could ask what she meant. The thing about old buildings is they hold on to their histories like some people hold grudges, tight and unforgiving. This farmhouse wore its past like a second skin, and some days I swear I could feel it breathing around me. The original oak beams would expand and contract with sounds that weren't quite settling, weren't quite structural. They were almost conversational, as if the house was constantly murmuring to itself about things that had happened in rooms I'd never see, during times I'd never know. By noon, the feeling started, that peculiar sensation of being observed, as if eyes were tracking my movement from just beyond my peripheral vision. I'd learned not to turn quickly. There was never anything there, and the sudden movement only made my heart race uselessly. Instead, I developed a habit of slow, deliberate movements, like I was underwater or trapped in thick honey. It helped maintain the illusion of normalcy. The contractors had felt it too. Last month, an electrician had walked off the job after swearing he'd seen a man in period clothing standing at the top of the stairs. The man had been solid enough, real enough, until the electrician blinked and found himself staring at empty air that somehow still felt occupied. The electrical work remained unfinished, and we'd learned to live with the flickering lights in the upper hallway. I tried to focus on my reports, cataloging tree disease patterns and logging permits, but the atmosphere grew heavier as afternoon approached. The air felt thick, resistant, as if the house was slowly filling with invisible water. My breathing became conscious, deliberate. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The sweet, sick smell intensified. At 2:15, I heard the piano. We didn't have a piano. The melody was simple, almost childlike, picked out with one finger on keys that hadn't existed in this building for at least 50 years. My coworker had mentioned finding an old photograph in the archives, a Christmas gathering from 1887, complete with a grand piano in what was now our break room. The music lasted exactly 43 seconds. I'd timed it after the third occurrence. The shadow appeared at 3:47. It moved independently of any light source, sliding along the wall like oil on water. Humanoid but wrong, too tall and too thin, with proportions that hurt to process. I kept my eyes on my computer screen, watching it in my peripheral vision as it paused outside my door. The temperature dropped perhaps 10 degrees. My breath misted in the suddenly arctic air. This was the worst part, the waiting. The shadow would stand there, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for an hour. And I'd learned that acknowledging it, looking at it directly, would trigger something I wasn't prepared to understand. So I sat, rigid as stone, fingers moving mechanically over my keyboard, typing words that made no sense while every instinct screamed at me to run. The gramophone started playing somewhere above me, another impossible sound from an object that didn't exist. A warbling, distant tune that might have been festive once but now sounded like a lament played through broken speakers. Christmas music, maybe. The house seemed to remember Christmas particularly well. I thought about the families who'd lived here, the research I'd done in the county records, the family of 7 who'd vanished during the winter of 1923, leaving Christmas dinner half-eaten on the table, the widow who'd run the boarding house and had been found sitting in her chair, eyes open, heart stopped, on Christmas Eve 1941, the children who'd died during the influenza, 3 of them, all under 10, their fever dreams perhaps still echoing in the walls. The shadow moved on, and I allowed myself a shaking breath. My hands were trembling, and I pressed them flat against the desk to steady them. The wood was ice-cold and slightly damp, though no moisture was visible. When I lifted my palms, they left brief impressions that filled with that same shadow substance before fading. My phone rang, a harsh modern sound that felt like violence in the thick atmosphere. My supervisor's voice crackled through speakers that suddenly seemed unreliable. She told me about the new hire starting next week, asked if I could show them around. I agreed, my voice surprisingly steady, even as I watched the cabinet doors in the kitchen begin their rhythmic opening and closing again. She asked if everything was all right, mentioned I'd seemed distracted lately. I assured her everything was fine, that the building just took some getting used to. After hanging up, I realized the sounds had stopped. The house had gone quiet in that way that felt like held breath, like the moment before something crucial happens. I stood slowly, joints stiff from sitting rigid for so long, and walked to the window. Outside, the forest pressed close, eternal and patient. But in the reflection of the glass, superimposed over the trees, I saw the room as it might have been: wallpaper instead of paint, gas lamps instead of fluorescence, and figures moving through the space with purpose and life. A woman in a long dress arranging something on a mantel that no longer existed. Children playing with toys in a corner now occupied by a copy machine. A man, tall and severe, standing exactly where I stood, looking out at the same forest with eyes that held the same questions. I blinked, and they were gone. But the feeling remained. The absolute certainty that I was not alone, had never been alone in this building. That the walls didn't just remember. They replayed endlessly. Moments of joy and sorrow worn so deep into the bones of the house that they'd become part of its structure. The closet door in the hallway slammed with enough force to shake the building. Once, twice, 3 times, always 3. I didn't investigate. I'd learned that some questions were better left unasked, some doors better left unopened. As evening approached and shadows grew longer, more substantial, I prepared to leave. But first I walked through each room, as had become my ritual, checking windows and locks while carefully not looking at the corners where darkness gathered too thick, too intentionally. In the break room, where the phantom piano played, I found fresh scratches on the floor, arc marks that traced the path where a piano bench might have been pulled out and pushed back in, over and over, by someone learning to play. The stairs creaked under footsteps that weren't mine as I descended. Behind me, always behind me, matching my pace perfectly. I'd learned not to stop, not to skip a step, not to alter my rhythm. The footsteps would continue regardless, and hearing them move independently was worse than this synchronized haunting. In the entrance hall, I paused at the door. The sweet sick smell was strongest here, and I finally recognized it. Not roses, but carnations. Funeral carnations. The kind they'd have used in the 1800s to mask other odors. The realization settled in my stomach like a stone. I turned the doorknob, modern brass that felt too new, too real against my palm. As I stepped outside, I heard it clearly for the first time. Not the echo of a voice, but an actual voice, gruff and immediate, speaking from just behind my right shoulder. It said my name. Not the name on my employment records, not the nickname my friends used, but a name I'd never told anyone. A childhood invention I'd whispered to myself in the dark when I was afraid. A name that existed nowhere but in my own memory. I didn't run. Running would mean admitting that something impossible had just happened. Instead, I walked steadily to my car, got in, and drove away. In the rearview mirror, the farmhouse stood silent and waiting. Windows dark except for one on the second floor where a figure stood watching. A figure that looked exactly like me. That was 2 months ago. I still work there. What choice do I have? Bills need paying, and jobs with the state are hard to come by. But I've noticed changes. My reflection sometimes lags a half second behind my movements. My shadow falls at angles that don't match the light sources. And sometimes, when I'm typing reports about forest management and environmental protection, I find myself writing other things. Descriptions of Christmas dinners I never attended, names of children I never knew, accounts of illnesses I never suffered. The house is teaching me its history, or maybe it's making me part of it. I can't tell anymore. The other staff members look at me the way they used to look at the building, with that careful wariness, that recognition of something not quite right. Yesterday, the new hire asked me about the building's quirks, and I heard myself giving the same speech my supervisor had given me. Character, I called it. The walls remember everything, but I didn't tell them the truth, that sometimes I catch myself remembering things that never happened to me. Christmas mornings in rooms that were demolished before I was born. The taste of medicines that haven't been prescribed in a century. The weight of clothes I've never worn. I didn't tell them that last week. I walked into the break room and saw myself sitting at a piano that wasn't there, playing a tune I don't know on keys my fingers have never touched, or that sometimes when the afternoon shadows grow long, I feel myself splitting. Part of me at my desk typing reports. Part of me walking the halls in clothes that aren't mine. Part of me standing at windows that have been boarded up for decades. The house remembers everything, yes. But lately I've started to wonder if it's not just remembering. Maybe it's collecting. Maybe every person who's worked here, lived here, died here, is still here in some way. Their moments replaying endlessly in an architectural memory that refuses to let go. And maybe this is the thought that keeps me awake at night. Maybe I've always been here. Maybe that figure in the 1887 photograph, the one standing by the piano with his back to the camera, isn't just similar to me. Maybe those footsteps on the stairs aren't following me but leading me, showing me the path I've walked 100 times before in a life I'm only now starting to remember. The building settles around me as I write this, walls exhaling their centuries of secrets. Tomorrow I'll go back. I'll sit at my desk and type my reports and pretend not to notice when the cabinets open or the shadows move. I'll pretend not to recognize the voice that calls my secret name. Pretend it doesn't sound exactly like my own voice, speaking from somewhere deep inside the walls where all the memories live. Because the alternative, accepting that the house isn't haunted but instead is doing the haunting, reaching into everyone who enters and pulling out the ghosts they might become, is too terrible to consider. The smell of funeral carnations is getting stronger. I can hear piano music, faint but growing closer, and in the reflection of my computer screen, I can see the room filling with people dressed for Christmas dinner, all of them wearing my face. The house remembers everything, and now, so do I. Story 11. The gun smoke hit me first, acrid, metallic, impossibly present in the humid Pennsylvania air. There were no reenactors that day, no demonstrations scheduled, just my family and me, standing in Devil's Den while the July sun beat down on rocks that had once run red with blood. My wife touched my arm, her fingers cold despite the heat, and I knew she smelled it too. We'd been coming to Gettysburg for 3 years running, drawn by something I couldn't quite name. History, maybe. Or perhaps the weight of all those deaths pressing against the thin membrane between then and now. Each visit brought us deeper into something that felt less like tourism and more like ritual. The clearing came on our second day. Our guide, a local woman with eyes that never quite focused on what she was looking at, led us through the cemetery as dusk painted everything amber and shadow. She spoke of Elizabeth, a girl who'd lost her mind when her betrothed died in the first day's fighting. "She walks here still," the guide whispered, though her voice carried unnaturally in the still air. A white light, dancing between the stones. I wanted to dismiss it as theater for the tourists, but then I saw it, a phosphorescent flicker weaving through the headstones 50 yards ahead. My daughter grabbed my hand, her palm slick with sweat. The light moved with purpose, pausing at certain graves as if reading names, searching for someone specific. When it suddenly rushed toward us, stopping just beyond arm's reach, the air turned winter cold. I could taste copper in my mouth, feel static electricity raising every hair on my body. The light hovered, pulsing with what seemed like breath, before dissolving into the gathering darkness. That night at the inn, the Farnsworth House they called it, though the name felt wrong in my mouth, I lay awake listening to the building settle around us. Built in 1810, the proprietor had told us with pride, as if age alone granted significance. Confederate sharpshooters had used the attic, picking off Union soldiers from the windows. 135 bullet holes still scarred the brick facade. The footsteps started at 3:17 a.m. I know because I'd been watching the red digits of the clock blur and sharpen as sleep refused to come. They were measured, deliberate, boot heels on wood despite the carpeted floor. They circled our bed once, twice, paused at the foot where my wife's feet made small mountains under the covers. She didn't stir. The room had gone so cold I could see my breath misting in the darkness. When my eyes adjusted, I saw him in the rocking chair by the window. Just a silhouette at first, but gradually details emerged. The kept cap, the brass buttons catching moonlight that shouldn't have been able to reach that corner of the room. He rocked slowly, rhythmically, and I realized he wasn't looking at me but through the window, watching something in the street below. standing guard. I must have blinked or dozed because suddenly the chair was empty, though it still moved slightly, as if just abandoned. The next morning, my wife asked why I'd been standing at the window all night. Our third visit to Gettysburg shifted something fundamental. We joined a walking tour of the battlefield, 20 strangers following a guide whose historical knowledge seemed less important than his ability to make us feel the weight of the place. At Little Round Top, as he described the desperate fighting of the 20th Maine, I noticed we'd gained an extra member. The figure stood at the edge of our group, wearing period clothing that looked too authentic, too lived in to be costume. Mud caked his boots, fresh mud, though it hadn't rained in weeks. When I looked directly at him, he seemed solid enough, but in my peripheral vision, he flickered like heat shimmer. Others walked through the space he occupied without seeming to notice, without that instinctive step aside we give to avoid collision. He followed us to the wheat field, where the guide spoke of the 4-hour battle that had turned the grain red. The stranger stood closer now, close enough that I could smell him. Gunpowder, sweat, and something else. Something organic and wrong. When he turned to look at me, his eyes were the color of old glass reflecting nothing. "You see them too?" My wife's whisper made me jump. She wasn't looking at the stranger but past him, toward the tree line where other figures stood in scattered formation. Some in blue, some in gray, all with that same quality of being there and not there simultaneously. The guide's voice droned on about casualties and tactics, but I couldn't focus. The figures were moving now, walking through our tour group, through each other, replaying movements that meant something once but were now just repetition without purpose. One passed so close I felt the chill of him, tasted metal again. His mouth moved as if speaking, but no sound came. Or perhaps the sound existed in a register I couldn't hear. That night, back at the inn, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd brought something back with us. The room felt crowded, though only my family was there. Shadows fell in directions that didn't match the lamp placement. The mirror reflected movement that wasn't ours. I woke, if I'd ever been asleep, to find the room transformed. Not physically, but in some fundamental way that made the familiar alien. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting slightly. The pattern in the wallpaper shifted when I wasn't looking directly at it, forming faces that dissolved the moment I tried to focus on them. The footsteps came again, but this time, they didn't circle. They approached the bed and stopped. I felt the mattress depress as if someone had sat on the edge. The weight was real, undeniable, making my body roll slightly toward it. A hand, I swear I felt a hand, touched my shoulder. Not threatening, but questioning. Testing. My wife mumbled something in her sleep that sounded like a response to an unheard question. My daughter, in the adjoining room, laughed, a single clear note that didn't belong to her voice. I understood then that Gettysburg doesn't let go. Each visit had been a negotiation, though I hadn't known I was negotiating. The battlefield doesn't just remember, it recruits. Every tourist who feels that inexplicable pull, who returns year after year, who begins to see what shouldn't be seen, is being evaluated, tested. The next morning, packing to leave, I found a minié ball on my pillow. Oxidized lead, authentic, with rifling marks from a gun that hadn't been fired in over a century. My wife had one too, and my daughter. Gifts or warnings, I couldn't tell. On the drive home, none of us spoke about the extra reflection I'd glimpsed in the rearview mirror, a fourth figure in our 3-person car, wearing a kept cap, watching the road behind us with eyes that had seen too much. We didn't discuss the smell of gun smoke that lingered in our clothes despite multiple washings, or the way shadows fell differently in our house now, creating corners where corners shouldn't exist. We didn't need to talk about next year's trip. We'd return. We always returned. Whether by choice or compulsion no longer mattered. Gettysburg had marked us, and perhaps we'd marked it too. In the quiet moments before sleep, I sometimes heard distant cannon fire, felt the house shake with impacts that happened over a century ago. My daughter had started drawing elaborate battle scenes she couldn't have learned from books. Too accurate, too specific in their carnage. My wife woke sometimes speaking names of soldiers we'd never heard of, reciting their wounds, their last words, as if taking inventory. And I found myself standing at windows in the dark hours, watching our street for movement, for dangers that had no business in our suburban present. The soldier in the rocking chair had been keeping watch, I realized. But watching for what? Or watching over whom? The answer felt close, pressing against my understanding like those figures pressing through the veil at Gettysburg. Maybe we weren't visitors anymore. Maybe we never had been. Maybe every family pulled to that battlefield, generation after generation, had always been part of something larger, something that needed witnesses or participants. In the basement, I found old photographs I didn't remember taking, our family at Gettysburg, but in each one, there were extra figures, soldiers standing beside us, their faces clear despite the impossibility. In one, the soldier from the rocking chair had his hand on my shoulder, and I was smiling as if I knew him, as if I'd always known him. The next morning, I woke to find my daughter standing at her window, still as a statue, watching our yard with eyes that looked older than her years. When I asked what she was looking for, she said, "They're coming. They always come before we go back." I looked out and saw nothing unusual, but the air shimmered in places, like heat rising from summer asphalt. The space between what was and what is had grown thin. Gettysburg wasn't just a place anymore. It was a condition, spreading through those of us who'd been chosen or cursed to carry it. We would go back. The pull was stronger now, undeniable, and each time we'd leave a little more of ourselves there while bringing more of it home with us. The boundary between past and present, between the living and the persistent dead, had become permeable. We were the breach, and through us, Gettysburg leaked into the world, one family at a time, one visit at a time, until the distinction between then and now, between them and us, ceased to matter at all. The gun smoke smell had become permanent in our house. Sometimes, looking at my family, I saw them in period dress, saw wounds that weren't there, heard them speak in voices that belonged to the dead, or perhaps we were the dead, imagining ourselves alive, replaying our own loop of visits to a battlefield that never stopped claiming victims, never stopped recruiting soldiers for a war that ended and never ended, that was fought once and was being fought still in spaces between seconds, in the corners of perception where the impossible becomes inevitable. Gettysburg doesn't let go, but maybe we don't want it to. Maybe we never did. Maybe that's what the soldier in the rocking chair understood, that some of us were always meant to be sentinels, standing watch at the borders between worlds, ensuring that what happened there continues to happen, continues to matter, continues to bleed through into a present that pretends the past is past. The minier balls sit on our mantle now, oxidizing further, growing heavier with each passing day, pulling us back with a gravity that has nothing to do with physics and everything to do with purpose we're only beginning to understand. Or remember, the distinction no longer seems important. We leave for Gettysburg again tomorrow. This time, I suspect, we won't be coming back alone. Or perhaps we won't be coming back at all, except in the way the soldier comes back to that rocking chair, the way Elizabeth returns to her clearing, the way all the watchers return, permanent and impermanent, real and unreal, keeping vigil for something that hasn't finished happening yet. The footsteps have started again. It's 3:17 a.m. They're not circling this time. They're waiting. Story 12. The stairs in our new home counted 17 steps from bottom to top. I know because I've climbed them 1,000 times since we moved in. Each footfall a measured beat against aged oak that seemed to remember every soul who'd ever ascended. The house perched on Ridgecrest Hill like a weathered sentinel, its Victorian bones settling into the earth with the satisfied groan of something that had found its permanent place. My wife fell in love with it immediately. The wraparound porch, the original hardwood floors, the way morning light flooded through the bay windows. I loved it too, or thought I did, before the stairs began their nightly performance. It started 3 weeks after we'd unpacked the last box. I lay in bed, my wife's breathing soft and rhythmic beside me, when I heard it, the unmistakable creak of weight on wood. Not the random settling of an old house. I'd grown accustomed to those symphonies already. This was deliberate, methodical. A footstep on the first stair, then silence Then another step, higher. The sound carried through the darkness with crystalline clarity, as if the house itself were amplifying each footfall for my benefit. I held my breath, muscles tensed, waiting. The steps continued their slow ascent. 3, 4, 5. Each one separated by perhaps 10 seconds of silence that stretched like pulled taffy. My rational mind offered explanations. The house cooling, wood contracting, pipes adjusting. But my body knew better. Every instinct screamed that someone was climbing our stairs. At the 7th step, exactly halfway up, the sound stopped. I waited 5 minutes, maybe 10, heart hammering against my ribs like a caged thing desperate for escape. Nothing. Finally, I slipped from bed, grabbed the baseball bat I'd started keeping in the closet, and crept to our bedroom door. The hallway beyond was a tunnel of shadows, the staircase barely visible in the ambient glow from a streetlight outside. Empty. Of course it was empty. I descended slowly, bat raised, checking each step as if it might reveal some secret. The 7th step, where the sound had stopped, felt different under my foot, not physically different, but wrong somehow, like stepping on ground where something terrible had happened. A coldness seemed to seep through my sock, traveling up my leg like an injection of ice water. I yanked my foot back, nearly tumbling down the remaining stairs. The living room was empty, kitchen empty, every door locked, every window secure. I climbed back to bed, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it, knowing I hadn't. The next night, the footsteps returned. Same time, 2:47 a.m. according to the glowing digits on my nightstand. Same measured pace. But this time, they climbed to the 9th step before stopping. I didn't investigate. I lay there, rigid as a corpse, listening to my own breathing mix with the house's nocturnal whispers. By the end of the first month, the footsteps had become a nightly ritual. Always starting at 2:47 a.m., always climbing a little higher. 11 steps. 13. 15. My wife never woke, never heard them, though I'd prod her shoulder and whisper urgently about the sounds. She'd mumble something about old houses and dreams and slip back into sleep while I remained sentinel, waiting for whatever was climbing to finally reach the top. I started avoiding the stairs during the day when possible. It sounds absurd, a grown man afraid of his own staircase. But that 7th step had developed a peculiar quality. Whenever I crossed it, ascending or descending, I felt resistance. Not physical exactly, more like walking through an invisible membrane of cold air that clung to my ankle, trying to hold me in place. Sometimes I'd feel what seemed like fingers wrapping around my calf, a grip that would release the moment I jerked my leg away. My wife noticed my odd behavior, the way I'd take the stairs 2 at a time, skipping the 7th entirely, or how I'd grip the banister white-knuckled as I descended. I made excuses about my knee acting up, about being careful on the old wood. She'd look at me with concern that gradually shifted toward something else. Worry, maybe, or doubt. 3 months in, the footsteps reached the 16th step, one below the landing. I lay in bed that night, muscles coiled, waiting for that final footfall that would bring whatever was climbing to our floor. But it never came. The presence, I'd started thinking of it as a presence, would pause at that penultimate step, and I would feel it there, just beyond the threshold of our bedroom door, waiting, watching. The air would thicken, taking on the density of held breath, until finally, after minutes that felt like hours, the sensation would recede like a tide pulling back from shore. I installed motion sensors on the stairs, little electronic eyes that should trigger lights if anything moved. They never activated during the footsteps. I sprinkled flour on the steps one evening, thinking I'd catch footprints. In the morning, the flour remained undisturbed except for my own prints from checking. I even set up my phone to record, but the audio only captured the house's normal creaks and sighs, nothing that resembled the deliberate footfalls that woke me nightly. My wife found the flour, the cameras, the motion sensors. We had what she called a conversation, but felt more like an interrogation. Was I sleeping? Was I stressed about work? Had I considered that maybe, just maybe, I was experiencing some kind of episode. The word therapy floated between us like a life raft I was too proud to grab. I insisted I was fine, that the house had quirks, that I was just being thorough. She looked at me the way you look at something fragile that might break if handled too roughly. The seventh step grew worse. The resistance became a daily battle, and more than once I found myself frozen there, leg held by something I couldn't see, panic rising in my throat like bile. I'd have to wrench myself free, stumbling up or down, heart racing. My wife never experienced it. She'd walk up and down those stairs with the casual grace of someone who belonged, while I moved like a man navigating a minefield. 5 months after moving in, things changed. The footsteps no longer stopped at the 16th step. They completed their journey, that final footfall landing on our floor with a weight that seemed to shake the entire house. Then silence, but not empty silence. Occupied silence, the kind that holds its breath and watches. I'd lie there, eyes straining against the darkness, trying to see what stood just beyond our bedroom door. Sometimes I thought I could make out a shape, darker than the darkness around it, tall and wrong in proportions that didn't quite fit human geometry. But when I'd blink, it would dissolve into ordinary shadows, leaving only the sensation of being observed by something patient and hungry. My wife started spending nights at her sister's place. She said it was to help with the new baby, but I knew better. She couldn't stand the way I'd jolt awake at 2:47, couldn't tolerate my insistence that something was in our house, couldn't watch me deteriorate into whatever I was becoming, because I was changing. I could feel it in the way food turned to ash in my mouth, the way sleep became a distant memory, the way the house seemed to pulse around me like a living thing. I stopped going upstairs altogether, setting up camp on the living room couch, but even there I could hear them, those measured footsteps climbing toward a bedroom I no longer entered. They'd reach the top, pause, and then I'd hear something new. Footsteps crossing the hallway, entering my bedroom. The creak of floorboards around the bed where I should have been sleeping, where I used to sleep beside a wife who now thought I'd lost my mind. 6 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days after we moved in, I made a decision. I would face whatever climbed our stairs. I would wait on that 7th step, the one that grabbed at me, that felt like crossing into somewhere else, and I would confront this thing that had invaded our home. At 2:30 a.m., I positioned myself on the 6th step, looking down into the darkness below. My hands trembled, but my resolve held firm. I needed to know. I needed to see. 2:47 a.m. arrived with the reliability of a train schedule. The first footstep echoed from below, though I could see nothing in the darkness. Then the second closer, the third. My heart hammered as the sound approached, each footfall reverberating through the wood into my bones. 4th step, 5th, 6th, directly below me. The air grew thick, viscous like trying to breathe underwater. The 7th step, the one above me, creaked under invisible weight. Something brushed past me, through me, and cold unlike anything I'd ever experienced flooded my body. Not the cold of winter or ice, but the cold of absence, of spaces between stars, of emptiness so complete it had its own terrible presence. I couldn't move. Whatever had passed through me had taken something vital, left something else in its place. The footsteps continued upward. 8, 9, 10. While I remained frozen, a statue of meat and terror. But now I understood something that made my situation infinitely worse. The presence on the stairs wasn't climbing toward my bedroom. It was climbing away from something below. The footsteps reached the top, entered the bedroom, and then, for the first time, I heard them descend the back staircase, the old servants' stairs we'd discovered behind a locked door in the master bedroom. Down they went, through the kitchen, into the basement we'd never quite gotten around to fully exploring. The basement with the dirt floor and stone walls that wept moisture and seemed to extend further than the house's foundation should allow. I finally managed to move as dawn light crept through the windows. On shaking legs, I descended to the living room and collapsed on the couch. My phone showed 17 missed calls from my wife, texts asking if I was okay, if I'd taken my medication, if she needed to come home. I didn't know how to tell her that I'd stood on our stairs and felt something ancient pass through me, something that climbed nightly from whatever lay beneath our dream home's foundation. That was 3 nights ago. I haven't left the house since. Can't leave. The 7th step won't let me pass anymore, not down anyway. I can go up. The house seems eager for me to go up, but descending past that step is like trying to walk through a wall of frozen fear. My wife came by yesterday, stood at the bottom of the stairs pleading with me to come down, to get help, to explain what was happening. But I could see it behind her, that dark shape that didn't quite fit in our foyer, standing patient and still, waiting for 2:47 a.m. when it would begin its climb again. She left when I started crying, promised to bring help, to bring doctors. They won't understand. How can I explain that our house sits on something that should have stayed buried? That the footsteps aren't an intrusion but an escape? That whatever climbs our stairs each night is fleeing something far worse below? Tonight I'll wait on the 7th step again. Not to confront what climbs, but to follow it down those back stairs when it returns. To see what lies beneath our home. To understand why the footsteps sound so much like my own. Why the presence feels familiar in ways that make my soul recoil. Why the 7th step holds me like it recognizes something in me that doesn't belong in the world above. The sun is setting now, painting our walls the color of old blood. Soon it will be dark. Soon it will be 2:47 a.m. Soon the footsteps will begin their measured ascent, and I will learn whether the thing that climbs our stairs each night is trying to escape what lies below, or leading me toward it. I can hear my wife's car in the driveway, voices, multiple footsteps on the porch. They think they're coming to save me. They don't understand that the house won't let them. It's been waiting so patiently, feeding on my fear, growing stronger with each night I've spent listening to those footsteps. The 7th step isn't trying to keep me from going down anymore. It's trying to keep everything else from coming up. The front door is opening. They're calling my name, but I'm already moving toward the back stairs, following the path the footsteps take each night, down into the darkness that feels like home, like recognition, like the place I was always meant to find. Behind me, I hear them climbing the main staircase, hear them reach the 7th step, hear them stop, hear them start to understand. The footsteps that wake me at 2:47 each night aren't coming from outside. They never were. They're the sound of me, climbing those stairs again and again, trying to escape what I've already become, what I've always been, what waits patient and hungry in the darkness below. But you can't escape yourself, and you can't escape home, not when home has been waiting for you all along. Story 13. I shouldn't have been there. That's the first thing anyone would say, and they'd be right. But when the pipes burst in my building at 2 in the morning, flooding 3 floors including mine, the university housing office gave me exactly one option: temporary assignment to Davidson Hall while they sorted out the mess. Davidson Hall, the all-women's dorm on the east side of campus. They put me on the 4th floor in what they called the visiting scholar suite, a glorified closet with a narrow bed and a window that overlooked the parking lot. The resident advisor, a grad student with tired eyes and a clipboard, had walked me through the hallway with the kind of brisk efficiency that suggested she wanted this interaction over as quickly as possible. Bathrooms at the end of the hall, she'd said without looking at me. Communal. There's a shower schedule posted on the door, but honestly, nobody follows it. Just try to go late or early when it's empty. Less awkward for everyone. I'd nodded, clutching my duffel bag, acutely aware of the doors cracking open as we passed, curious eyes peering out at the unexpected male presence in their domain. The hallway smelled like vanilla and laundry detergent, undercut by something else. Something stale and slightly organic, like old water sitting too long in a vase. That first night, I'd waited until 3 in the morning to attempt a shower. The bathroom was mercifully empty, a long space with white tile that had yellowed at the grout lines, 6 shower stalls along one wall, sinks and mirrors along the other. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, one of them flickering in an irregular rhythm that made my eyes hurt if I looked at it too long. I'd noticed it immediately. The last stall, the one in the far corner. Its door hung slightly crooked, and there was a gap at the bottom wider than the others, wide enough to see the drain inside. The tile around it looked darker, water-stained or maybe just older. Something about it made me choose the stall on the opposite end, as far from it as I could get. The shower had been quick, uncomfortable, the institutional soap not quite lathering right, the water pressure inconsistent. I'd kept my eyes on the curtain the whole time, half expecting it to suddenly pull back. When I'd finally emerged, towel wrapped around my waist, the bathroom had felt different. Colder. The flickering light seemed to have spread, or maybe I was just more aware of it, the way the illumination pulsed unevenly, creating pockets of shadow that shifted and breathed. The door to the last stall was open now. I was certain it had been closed before. I dressed quickly, gathered my things, and left without looking back. In the hallway, I'd passed two girls in pajamas, both of them giving me wide berth, pressing themselves against the wall. One of them had whispered something to the other, too low for me to hear, and they'd both laughed, but it wasn't a friendly sound. The second night, I'd tried to wait even later. 4 a.m, late enough that surely everyone would be asleep. But when I'd entered the bathroom, someone was already there. I could hear the shower running in one of the middle stalls, see the steam rising over the top of the curtain. I'd started to back out, mumbling an apology to the empty air, when a voice called out, "It's fine. Just don't use the last one." The voice was flat, matter of fact. The shower kept running. I couldn't see who was speaking. "Sorry," I'd said, my hand still on the door. "The last stall. Don't use it. Nobody uses it." There was a pause, water drumming against tile, then, "It's wrong." I'd wanted to ask what that meant, but something in the tone suggested the conversation was over. I'd chosen the second stall this time, the one next to where the voice was coming from. The water had taken forever to warm up, and while I waited, standing there in my boxers with my hand under the stream, I'd heard the other shower turn off. The curtain rings had scraped along the rod, a harsh metallic sound that echoed off the tile. Footsteps, wet and slapping, then silence. "Hello?" I'd called out. No response, just the sound of my own shower starting to steam, and underneath it, almost imperceptible, a soft dripping from somewhere else in the room. Not from any of the shower heads. Slower, more deliberate, like something counting time. I'd looked toward the last stall. The door was closed now, definitely closed, but there was water seeping out from underneath it, spreading across the tile in a dark, wandering line. The fluorescent lights chose that moment to flicker in unison, all of them at once, and in the strobe-like darkness between pulses, I could have sworn the water looked black. I didn't shower that night. I'd grabbed my things and left, my skin still dry, my hair unwashed. Back in my room, I'd sat on the edge of the narrow bed and tried to convince myself I was being ridiculous. Paranoid. This was just an uncomfortable situation made worse by lack of sleep and an unfamiliar environment. The water was probably just dirty, old pipes, sediment in the system. The voice had been real, another student, and she'd just been messing with the weird guy temporarily invading their space. But my hands had been shaking when I'd finally lay down, and I'd kept the lights on until dawn started to gray the window. By the third day, I'd heard the stories. Not directed at me, but overheard in snatches of conversation in the hallway, in the stairwell, fragments that found me whether I wanted them or not. Nobody talked about it directly, but everyone seemed to know. "She saw it again last week," one voice had said, behind a door I was passing. "Of course she did. She's always seeing things," another had responded, skeptical but not quite dismissive. "Well, someone keeps leaving the door open, and it's not like any of us would go near it." I'd slowed my pace, pretending to check my phone, trying to hear more. "Do you think he knows?" the first voice had asked, dropping to a whisper. "Probably not. Nobody's going to tell him. Why would we?" They'd gone quiet then, Or maybe they'd noticed my shadow in the gap under their door, because when I'd glanced back, the slice of light from their room had been suddenly blocked, as if someone was standing right on the other side looking out. That night, I decided to skip the shower entirely. I'd use the sink in my room, make do with wet wipes, anything to avoid that bathroom. But around midnight, someone had knocked on my door. 3 sharp raps. Urgent, but not loud. When I'd opened it, there was no one there, just the empty hallway, its lights dimmed for night hours, creating long shadows between the doorways. But on the floor, right in front of my threshold, was a piece of paper, folded once. I'd picked it up, looked both ways down the corridor, then closed and locked my door before opening it. The handwriting was neat, feminine, written in blue pen. Don't shower after 2 a.m. Don't use the last stall. Don't look if you hear the door open. It doesn't like to be seen. No signature. No indication of who had left it. I'd stood there holding the note, reading it over and over, trying to find some hint of a prank, some indication that this was hazing or a joke at the temporary male resident's expense. But the paper was ordinary notebook paper, the ink neither dramatic nor playful. The words were stated simply, like instructions, like a warning that needed to be delivered, but that the writer didn't particularly want to elaborate on. I'd put the note in my desk drawer and tried to forget about it. But 2 nights later, I'd woken to the sound of a door slamming. Not my door. Somewhere else on the floor, distant but distinct, the sharp crack of wood against frame. Then another sound, softer, like something being dragged, or something moving on its own, wet and heavy, scraping along tile. My room was silent except for the ambient noise of the building, the hum of electricity in the walls, the occasional creak of old construction settling. But underneath it all, I could hear water running. Not in my room. Down the hall, in the communal bathroom. I'd sat up in bed, my heart already racing before my conscious mind had fully caught up with what I was hearing. The clock on my nightstand read 3:17 a.m. The hallway light that usually glowed faintly under my door was darker than usual, as if some of the bulbs had burned out. The water kept running. Not all the showers, just one. And even through my closed door, through the walls and the distance, I could hear it clearly. Too clearly. As if the sound was being amplified, or as if my hearing had suddenly sharpened, tuned to some frequency that shouldn't be accessible. I'd gotten out of bed before I could talk myself out of it. I'd pulled on sweatpants, unlocked my door as quietly as possible, and stepped into the hallway. The bathroom door was open, just slightly, a gap of maybe 3 inches, enough to let a slice of sickly fluorescent light spill into the corridor. The light flickered, that same uneven rhythm I'd noticed before, but faster now, more agitated, and the sound of the water was louder, almost roaring, as if every shower was running at full blast, even though I knew that wasn't possible. I'd approached slowly, every instinct screaming at me to go back to my room, lock the door, bury myself under the covers like I was 7 years old again and afraid of the dark. But I was 23, supposedly an adult, supposedly rational, and this was just a bathroom with bad plumbing in an old building. I'd pushed the door open wider. All the showers were off. The sinks were dry. The sound I'd heard, that roaring water, had stopped the instant I'd crossed the threshold, cut off so abruptly that the silence felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. But the last stall's door was open, wide open, hanging crooked on its hinges, and the space inside it was darker than it should have been. Not shadow exactly, something denser, something that moved slightly, contracting and expanding like breath, like the walls themselves were inhaling and exhaling. I'd taken a step backward, my hand fumbling for the bathroom door. That's when I'd seen it form. Not all at once. Gradually, like smoke gathering, like ink diffusing through water but in reverse, concentrating instead of dispersing. A shape that was almost human, almost familiar, but wrong in proportions I couldn't quite identify. Taller than it should be, or maybe just stretched, the top of it brushing the ceiling tiles, its lower half still connected to that darkness in the stall, as if it was pulling itself out from some depth I couldn't see. It had no face, or it had too many faces, shifting across the surface of the mist, features appearing and dissolving too quickly to register as anything more than the suggestion of eyes, of a mouth, of something that might be trying to remember how to look human and failing. I'd run, not walked quickly, not retreated with dignity. Run. Flat out, my bare feet slapping against the linoleum, my breath coming in sharp gasps that burned my throat. The hallway had seemed longer than before, the distance to my room stretching impossibly, doors whipping past me on both sides, but none of them the right one. Behind me, I'd heard the bathroom door slam open, crashing against the wall with enough force that I'd heard tile crack. Then footsteps. Or not footsteps, but something similar. A rhythmic sound that was too wet, too heavy, accompanied by that same dragging noise I'd heard earlier. I'd risked a glance over my shoulder. The mist was in the hallway, spilling out from the bathroom like water breaching a dam, but moving faster than water could move, flowing upward along the walls as much as forward along the floor. And in its center, that shape, that almost human figure, coming after me with a terrible, patient inevitability. My room. Finally. I'd grabbed the handle, twisted, shoved the door open and thrown myself inside, slamming it behind me so hard the frame shook. The lock. I'd fumbled with the deadbolt, my fingers slipping, finally getting it turned just as something on the other side hit the door. The impact hadn't been loud. It should have been loud, should have shaken the whole door, but instead it was soft, muffled, like a hand pressing against the wood, like something testing the barrier, learning its shape, its weight, its weakness. I'd backed away from the door, my eyes locked on the handle, waiting for it to turn. It didn't turn, but under the door, in that gap where light should have been showing through from the hallway, there was darkness, absolute darkness, thicker than shadow, and it was moving, seeping in just slightly, a tendril of black mist extending into my room like a finger reaching, searching. I'd grabbed the towel from the back of my desk chair and shoved it against the gap, stuffing it tight. The darkness had recoiled, pulling back, and for a moment there was nothing. Then the shadows outside my door had started moving. I could see them through the gap at the top of the door, through the space between the frame and the wall. Dark shapes passing back and forth, pacing, not walking like a person would walk, but moving nonetheless, sliding from one side to the other and back again, over and over, patient but restless, waiting but not still. I'd stood there watching until the sky outside my window had started to lighten, until the shadows had gradually faded, until the hallway lights had returned to their normal dim glow, and the building had started to wake around me, doors opening, voices in the corridor, the sounds of morning routines beginning. When I'd finally opened my door, the hallway had been normal. Students moving between rooms, someone brushing their teeth at the water fountain, the resident advisor checking her mailbox. No black mist, no darkness under the bathroom door. But when I'd walked past it, when I'd glanced through the open doorway, the last stall's door had been closed again, and the tile around it had been wet, gleaming under the fluorescent lights. A trail of water leading from it across the floor and stopping right at the threshold, as if something had emerged, had followed me, and then had returned to wait. The resident advisor had looked up as I passed, had met my eyes for just a second. In that brief moment, I'd seen recognition there. Not surprise, not confusion. Just a tired kind of acknowledgement, and something else underneath it that might have been pity. She'd gone back to her mailbox without saying anything. I have 4 more days before my building is ready. 4 more nights in this room with that bathroom at the end of the hall. The note is still in my drawer, and I've read it so many times the paper is starting to wear at the creases. Last night, someone knocked on my door again. 3 times, the same urgent rhythm. I didn't open it. I don't think I will, but I can hear the water running now, even during the day. Even when I'm certain no one is showering. It's constant, just at the edge of my hearing. And sometimes I think it's not coming from the bathroom at all. Sometimes I think it's coming from inside the walls. The lights in my room have started to flicker. Story 14. The house on Elderwood Street had stood since 1830, and it wore its age like a second skin. Warped floorboards that groaned under footsteps, windows that rattled in their frames even on windless nights, and walls that seemed to exhale the mustiness of centuries past. Summer's family had owned it for 3 generations, and when Jake and I started spending our weekends there during our sophomore year of college, we thought the creaking and settling were charming, quaint even, the kind of atmospheric imperfections you'd expect from a place with history. We were idiots. It started innocuously enough that I almost didn't register it as a beginning at all. Jake and I had crashed in Summer's guest room after a long evening of pizza and horror movies. Ironic, considering what was to come. The room sat at the end of the second-floor hallway, with a 4-poster bed that had probably seen more history than most museums. The mattress sagged in the middle, forcing whoever slept there to roll toward the center, and the quilt smelled faintly of lavender and something older, something I couldn't quite place. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to pressure. Not pain, exactly. Not even discomfort in the traditional sense. Just the unmistakable sensation of weight settling onto the mattress near my feet. The bed dipped, springs creaking in that specific way they do when someone sits down. My eyes snapped open, but the darkness was absolute. The kind of dark you only get in old houses far from streetlights, where shadows pool so thick they seem almost solid. I held my breath and listened. Jake's breathing came slow and steady from his side of the bed. Summer's room sat 2 doors down. The house was silent except for its usual symphony of settling wood and shifting foundation. But the weight remained, pressing down on the quilt near my ankles, and I could feel the slight tilt of the mattress, the subtle redistribution of gravity that comes when someone else shares your space. My hand fumbled for my phone on the nightstand. The screen blazed to life, flooding the room with harsh blue light, and I swept it across the bed's surface. Empty, just rumpled quilts and Jake's unconscious form. But the weight didn't disappear with the light. If anything, it felt more pronounced now that I was fully awake, more insistent. I could trace its outline in my mind. Roughly the size and shape of a person sitting cross-legged at the foot of the bed, watching us sleep. Then it lifted. Not gradually, but all at once, like someone standing up quickly. The mattress bounced slightly with the released pressure, and I heard, or thought I heard, the soft pad of footsteps crossing the hardwood floor toward the door. The door that I was certain we'd closed. The door that now stood open. In the wedge of deeper darkness visible through the doorway, something moved. Not walked, not floated. Moved in a way that defied both verbs. A flowing darkness that was somehow darker than the surrounding night. It had height and mass, but no defined edges, like smoke given weight and purpose. For a fraction of a second, it hung there in the doorway, and I felt absolutely certain it was looking at me. Then it poured itself into the hallway and was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. When I finally told Jake about it over breakfast, he laughed and blamed the spicy sausage on the pizza. Summer, arranging fresh flowers in a vase by the kitchen window, didn't laugh. She glanced at her mother, who was reading the newspaper at the table, and something unspoken passed between them. Her mother's knuckles went white where she gripped the paper's edges, but she said nothing. We didn't talk about it again. Not then. Life continued as it does. Classes and exams and the normal rhythm of college existence absorbed us. The memory of that night faded to the texture of a dream, something I could almost convince myself I'd imagined. Jake and I kept visiting Summer's house. Why wouldn't we? It was a great place to hang out, spacious and private, with that romantic decay that makes for great photographs and better stories. 3 years passed before it happened again. By then, Jake had graduated and moved across the country for a job in Seattle. I'd stayed local, working on my master's degree, and Summer and I had grown closer. I spent most weekends at the house, helping her renovate some of the first-floor rooms, stripping ancient wallpaper that crumbled like dried leaves in our hands. We'd fallen into an easy rhythm, the kind of comfortable companionship that doesn't require constant conversation. That particular Saturday, we were working on her bedroom, finally getting around to painting the walls a warm cream color to replace the faded rose pattern that had presided there since her grandmother's time. The room sat at the front of the house, overlooking Elderwood Street through two tall windows flanked by heavy curtains that had probably been elegant once but now just looked tired. A full-length mirror hung inside her closet door, angled so you could see it from most of the room. One of those old mirrors with a wooden frame carved with flowers and birds, the silvering on the back starting to mottle and peel. We'd been painting for hours, and my shoulders ached from holding the roller aloft. Summer had music playing from her phone, something upbeat and modern that felt incongruous with the house's age, and we were laughing about something stupid Jake had posted on social media when I glanced toward the closet. In the mirror, I saw it. Tall, impossibly tall. A figure that would have had to stoop to fit under the 8-foot ceiling, standing in the corner behind us. But not standing the way a person stands. This was more like darkness had been poured into a roughly human shape and left to settle into something approximately vertical. It had no features I could make out, no face or hands or clothing. Just that terrible absolute blackness, like someone had cut a hole in reality, and I was seeing straight through to some place where light had never been invented. I froze mid-laugh, the sound dying in my throat. The roller slipped from my hand and hit the drop cloth with a wet splat. Summer turned to see what was wrong, following my gaze to the mirror, and I watched her face go slack, watched the color drain from her cheeks like water down a sink. We stood there for what might have been seconds or hours. Time felt elastic, stretched thin by terror, both of us staring at the mirror. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, towering in the corner, and I had that same overwhelming certainty I'd felt years ago in the guest room. It was watching us, studying us. The attention felt physical, a pressure against my skin, and my lungs refused to draw a full breath. Then Summer turned around to look at the actual corner, the real corner, not the reflection. I tore my eyes from the mirror to look with her. Empty, just walls and baseboards and the scattered detritus of our renovation project. When we looked back at the mirror, it was gone. Neither of us screamed. Neither of us ran. We just stood there, breathing hard, staring at our own pale reflections in that old mirror. Summer's hand found mine and squeezed so hard my bones ground together. Her palm was slick with sweat, or maybe mine was. I couldn't tell. When she finally spoke, her voice came out barely above a whisper. She said she'd seen it before. Different times, different rooms, always in reflections or peripherally, never head-on. Never when she looked directly at where it should be. Her mother had seen them too, she told me, though her mother never spoke about it. The word them made my stomach drop. Not it, them, plural, as though the house harbored more than one of whatever we'd just witnessed. We left the painting unfinished and went downstairs. Summer made tea, though neither of us drank it. We sat at the kitchen table as afternoon light slanted through the windows, and she told me about her mother's childhood in this house, about how her grandmother had brought in a priest when her mother was 11, had the entire second floor blessed with holy water and prayer, about how it had worked for a while. The shadows had retreated, grown dormant, become just shadows again, the normal kind that light creates and dismisses at will. But faith is a difficult thing to maintain when life gets hard, she said. Her mother had told her this once, late at night after too much wine. When Summer's grandfather died, when her grandmother got sick, when money troubles and marriage troubles and all the accumulated weight of living pressed down, the prayers had faltered and the shadows apparently noticed. They came back. I should have stopped going to the house after that. Any rational person would have. But rationality has very little to do with human behavior, I've learned. The house was part of my routine, part of my life. Summer was my best friend. And there was something else, something I'm not proud to admit. Curiosity. A dark, insistent need to understand, to see it again, to confirm it was real. The next few visits passed without incident. We painted Summer's room, finished the job, and the mirror showed us nothing but our own reflections. I started to relax, started to think maybe it had been a trick of the light, a shared hallucination brought on by paint fumes and exhaustion. The mind is capable of extraordinary deceptions after all. Maybe we'd both just been primed by the house's atmosphere, by my old story about the guest room, by too many late-night horror movies in creaky rooms. Then Ethan saw it. Ethan was a mutual friend, someone from our old study group who'd stayed in touch. He came by one afternoon to help move some furniture out of one of the upstairs rooms. Summer was finally tackling the third-floor restoration. We'd been hauling boxes and old chairs down the narrow staircase for an hour, sweating in the late summer heat, when Ethan went out to his car for water bottles. When he came back in, he was grinning. He asked if Summer's brother was home, said he'd just seen him looking out the upstairs window, wanted to see if he needed help with something up there. Summer's brother lived in Boston, had for 5 years. The three of us stood in the foyer, Ethan still smiling, not understanding why we'd both gone so still. Summer's voice was careful when she asked which window. He pointed toward the front of the house, to one of the third-floor windows that overlooked the street, said he'd seen someone tall, standing there. A man, he thought, though the glass was old and distorted things a bit. He'd waved, but the figure had just stood there. We went upstairs together, all three of us. The room behind that window was empty, thick with dust and filled with furniture draped in sheets. No one had been up there in weeks. The floorboards were covered in an undisturbed layer of grime, no footprints visible in the film of accumulated time. But at the window, when we looked out at the street below, I could see exactly where someone standing would be perfectly framed in the glass, perfectly visible from outside. Ethan's smile had vanished. He left shortly after, made some excuse about an appointment. I haven't seen him since. He doesn't return Summer's messages. That night I stayed over. Summer asked me to, and I could hear the plea underneath the casual invitation. Neither of us wanted to be alone in the house. We set up camp in the living room, pushing the furniture back and spreading blankets on the floor like we were having some kind of sleepover. We left lights on, all of them, every lamp, every overhead fixture, burning away the shadows until the house blazed like a beacon. But light doesn't stop everything. Around midnight, the bulb in the far corner lamp blew with a sharp pop, and darkness flooded back into that quadrant of the room. Then another bulb went, and another, tracing a path around the room's perimeter. Not all at once. That would have been too obvious, too much like a horror movie cliché. No. They died one by one over the course of an hour, each failure accompanied by that brittle pop of filaments giving way, until we were sitting in an island of light that grew smaller and smaller. We didn't talk. We just sat there, shoulder to shoulder on the blankets, watching the darkness encroach. The house around us seemed to come alive in a way it never had before. Every creak and groan sounded deliberate. The wind against the windows carried whispers in its wake. Or maybe that was just the wind, just air moving through old cracks in ancient wood. I couldn't tell anymore. Couldn't trust my own senses. When the last lamp died, plunging us into absolute darkness, Summer's hand found mine again. Her grip was trembling. I could hear her breathing, quick and shallow, and feel my own heart hammering against my ribs like something trying to break free. The darkness was total, oppressive, pressing against my eyes until I started seeing phantom shapes and colors, my brain trying desperately to make sense of the sensory void. Then I felt it. That weight. That presence. Not on the blankets this time, but in the room with us. All around us. Multiple somethings. Multiple sources of attention focused with laser precision on two terrified people huddled on a living room floor. The air felt thick, hard to breathe, and cold. So cold I could see my breath even though it was August and the house had no air conditioning. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees in a matter of seconds. Summer whispered my name, and I wanted to answer but couldn't make my voice work. The darkness had weight now, texture like invisible fabric brushing against my skin. I felt something move past me, inches from my face, displacing air that smelled of dust and decay and something else, something organic and wrong that made my hindbrain scream predator, even though I couldn't see anything at all. How long we sat there, I don't know. It might have been minutes. It might have been hours. Eventually, dawn came, light creeping through the windows in grudging increments, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted like fog burning off in sunlight. The room was just a room again. The darkness was just darkness, no longer pregnant with malevolent attention. We didn't talk about it. Not then. Not really ever. What was there to say? That we'd sat in the dark and felt scared? That old houses are creepy and our imaginations got the better of us? The explanations felt thin, unconvincing even to me, but the alternative was worse. The alternative meant accepting that something shared the house with us, something that had been there long before Summer's family and would remain long after. Summer's mother finally told us the whole story a few weeks later. We'd been avoiding the house, or I had anyway, making excuses about schoolwork and job applications. But Summer called me one evening, said her mother wanted to talk to us, asked if I'd come over. We sat in the kitchen again, that same table where we'd had tea after seeing the figure in the mirror. Her mother looked older than I remembered, more tired, like the weight of years had suddenly caught up with her all at once. She told us about growing up in the house, about seeing the shadows as far back as she could remember, about how her mother had tried to convince her they were nothing, just tricks of light, just an old house settling. But they weren't. She knew they weren't. They watched her, followed her. She'd wake up to find them standing at the foot of her bed, tall and silent, and utterly, terribly still. The blessing had worked because she'd believed it would work. Faith, she said, was a powerful thing. It created a barrier, pushed them back into whatever corners or cracks or other spaces they inhabited. But faith required maintenance, required constant reinforcement, and life had a way of eroding even the strongest beliefs. Her father's death, her mother's dementia, a divorce she never saw coming. The shadows crept back in during those dark years, testing the boundaries, growing bolder as her defenses weakened. She'd never told Summer because what was there to tell? Stay out of your own home, abandon a house that had been in the family for generations, admit that something impossible lived in the walls. So she'd kept quiet and hoped maybe they'd leave her daughter alone. That hope had proven false. I asked her what they wanted. It seemed like the obvious question, the one any rational person would ask when confronted with the impossible. She looked at me with eyes that had seen too much, and she said she didn't know. They didn't communicate. They didn't threaten. They just were. Present. Watching. Waiting for something she couldn't name. I haven't been back to the house since that conversation. Summer still lives there. Where else would she go? But we meet for coffee in town now, or at my apartment, anywhere but Elderwood Street. She doesn't talk about whether she still sees them. I don't ask. Some questions are better left unspoken. But sometimes, late at night in my own apartment, I wake up with that familiar feeling of weight settling onto my mattress. I tell myself it's nothing, just my imagination, primed by experience and fed by fear. Just the normal settling of furniture, the natural sounds of a building at rest. I don't turn on the lights. I don't look, because part of me, the part that spent that night in the guest room, that saw the figure in the mirror, that felt the presence in the living room darkness, knows that seeing won't help, won't change anything. The shadows exist whether I acknowledge them or not, whether I believe in them or not. And maybe that's the most terrifying thing of all. Not the shadows themselves, but the understanding that reality is thinner than we like to believe, that the world we think we know is just a comfortable fiction we tell ourselves, that beneath the surface of the ordinary and explicable, something else moves and watches and waits with the patience of centuries. I think about Summer sometimes, still living in that house on Elderwood Street, still sleeping under that roof, still walking those halls where darkness pools in corners and reflections show things that aren't there. I wonder if she's accepted them as part of the architecture now, as much a fixture as the warped floorboards and rattling windows. I wonder if that makes it easier or worse. I wonder if I should have stayed, should have helped her find a way to push them back like her mother once did. If faith can create barriers, maybe friendship could do the same. But I'm not brave enough to test that theory. I barely manage to maintain the fiction of normalcy in my own life, convincing myself each morning that the previous night's disturbances were nothing, meant nothing, proved nothing. The weight on my mattress is just settling springs. The cold spots in my apartment are just poor insulation. The feeling of being watched is just paranoia, just the normal anxiety of modern existence. I tell myself these things. I almost believe them. And every night I close my eyes and hope that when I open them, the darkness will still be empty. Hope is not the same as faith, but sometimes it's all we have left. Story 15. The first explosion came 3 days after we moved into the farmhouse. I was unpacking boxes in what would become my study when the sound hit, a thunderous detonation that seemed to rise from the earth itself, shaking the limestone foundation so violently that books tumbled from their half-arranged stacks. The windows rattled in their frames. Dust particles danced in the afternoon light, disturbed from decades of rest in the ceiling beams. My uncle stood frozen in the doorway, his weathered hands still gripping the toolbox he'd been carrying. We locked eyes for a moment, both of us waiting for something, an explanation, an aftershock, anything. But the silence that followed was absolute, pressing against my eardrums like water pressure. The guard dogs were losing their minds in the yard. I'd inherited the property 6 months earlier, when my uncle's brother, a man I'd met only twice, passed away without other heirs. The farmhouse sat on the edge of what had once been an active limestone quarry, abandoned sometime in the 70s. According to the deed, the land stretched for nearly 200 acres, most of it reclaimed by the Atlantic forest that carpets the hills of southern Brazil. The quarry itself was somewhere in that green expanse, though I hadn't yet ventured deep enough to find it. My uncle had agreed to help me settle in, spending a few weeks getting the place habitable again. He knew these rural areas well, having grown up in a neighboring town before moving to the city 40 years ago. But even he seemed unsettled by the explosion. We went outside to investigate. The 2 dogs, Ronaldo and Bella, left behind by the previous owner, had retreated to the far corner of the yard, pressed against the fence. Their barking had devolved into low, continuous whining. Ronaldo, a massive mixed breed with the build of a mastiff, was actually trembling. The forest began about 50 yards from the house, a wall of green that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. My uncle walked to the edge of the property, scanning the tree line with narrowed eyes. "Could be hunters," he offered, though his voice carried no conviction. "Or maybe someone clearing land illegally." "That didn't sound like a shotgun," I said. He conceded the point with a grunt. The sound had been too massive, too deep. It reminded me of footage I'd seen of controlled demolitions in cities, the way entire buildings shuddered before collapsing into themselves. We spent the rest of the afternoon listening for more explosions, but none came. The dogs refused to leave their corner, even when I brought their food bowls out. As evening settled over the property, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I found myself studying the forest with the attention that bordered on obsession. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper than they should be, as if the darkness was pooling there, waiting. The second explosion came 4 nights later, at 2 in the morning. This time I was in bed, hovering in that liminal space between sleep and waking. The detonation yanked me into full consciousness with the force of a physical blow. The entire house shook. My bed frame scraped against the wooden floor. Something in the kitchen, glasses perhaps, shattered with a crystalline crash. I scrambled out of bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. Through the window, I could see nothing but darkness and the vague shapes of trees swaying in a wind I couldn't feel inside. The dogs were barking again, that same frantic, terrified sound. My uncle appeared in the hallway, fully dressed despite the hour. I realized he'd probably been unable to sleep, waiting for exactly this. "We should call someone," I said. "Who?" he asked. "The police station is 40 kilometers away. By the time they arrive, there'll be nothing to find." He was right, of course. And what would we even report? An unexplained explosion somewhere in the forest? We had no evidence, no location, nothing concrete. Just the lingering vibration in our bones and the testimony of terrified dogs. This time, my uncle insisted we go look. He retrieved 2 powerful flashlights from his truck and a machete for clearing brush. I pulled on jeans and boots, my hands shaking slightly as I tied the laces. The night air was thick with humidity and the chorus of insects. Our flashlight beams cut pale tunnels through the darkness as we approached the forest edge. The dogs had fallen silent now, but I could see their eyes reflecting our lights from the corner where they huddled. "Ronaldo," I called. "Come." The dog's whining intensified, but he didn't move. Bella pressed closer against him, as if trying to disappear into his bulk. We entered the forest. The canopy was so dense that our flashlights barely penetrated 10 feet ahead. The path, if it could be called that, was overgrown with ferns and creeping vines. Strange flowers bloomed in the shadows, pale and ghostly. The smell of rotting vegetation mixed with something mineral, chalky. Limestone dust, I realized, still present in the soil after all these years. We walked for maybe 20 minutes, my uncle occasionally hacking at particularly dense patches of growth. The forest seemed to press in from all sides, and I became acutely aware of how easy it would be to get lost in this place. The trees all looked the same, twisted and ancient, their bark covered in moss that glowed faintly in our lights. Then my uncle stopped so abruptly that I nearly walked into him. "Look," he whispered. His flashlight illuminated a clearing ahead, perhaps 30 feet across. The ground there was disturbed, not like an explosion had occurred, but as if something large had been dragged through the dirt, leaving parallel grooves that disappeared into the undergrowth on the far side. In the center of the clearing, the earth was compressed, flattened, as though tremendous weight had been applied from above. But there was no crater, no debris, no signs of fire or chemical burning. Just smooth, packed dirt and those strange drag marks. My uncle moved his light slowly across the scene. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. I agreed, though I couldn't articulate exactly what was wrong. The clearing felt staged somehow, artificial, and there was a smell in the air here, stronger than elsewhere. That mineral scent, but with an undertone of something acrid, like ozone after lightning. We stood there for several minutes, both of us reluctant to enter the clearing itself. The forest around us was silent. No insects, no birds, nothing. Just the sound of our breathing and the faint rustle of leaves in that unfelt wind. "We should go back," I finally said. My uncle nodded, and I saw relief flash across his face in the reflected glow of his flashlight. The return journey felt longer, though we were following the same path. Several times I had the distinct sensation that we were being watched, that something was pacing us through the trees, staying just beyond the reach of our lights. I kept spinning around, trying to catch whatever it was, but saw only shadows and vegetation. When we finally emerged from the forest, I felt a physical sense of relief, as if I'd been holding my breath underwater and had just broken the surface. The dogs were exactly where we'd left them, still pressed against the fence. They wouldn't come into the house that night. Even when dawn broke and my uncle carried their bowls outside, they only approached enough to eat quickly before retreating to their corner again. My uncle left 3 days later. He never said explicitly that the explosions had driven him away, but I could see it in the way he kept glancing at the forest, in how he flinched at every unexpected sound. On his last morning, as he loaded his truck, he suggested again that I might want to sell the property. "This place," he said, gesturing vaguely at the farmhouse and the forest beyond. "It has a history, not all of it good." I pressed him for details, but he just shook his head. He mentioned something about the quarry workers in the old days, accidents that had been hushed up, but he wouldn't elaborate. As he drove away, leaving a trail of dust on the dirt road, I felt truly alone for the first time since arriving. The explosions continued, but with no discernible pattern. Sometimes days would pass in silence. Other times they came in clusters, 3 or 4 in a single night. I grew almost accustomed to them, though my body never stopped reacting. The spike of adrenaline, the racing heart, the primal need to flee. What disturbed me more was what came after. It started about 2 weeks after my uncle's departure. I was working in my study, trying to focus on the freelance translation work that paid my bills, when I heard it. A sound like a jet engine, low and powerful, seeming to come from directly above the house. I rushed outside, scanning the sky. Nothing. Clear blue, empty except for a few distant clouds. But the sound continued, so loud it made my teeth ache. A deep thrumming that I felt in my chest cavity. It seemed to hover, stationary, as if something massive was suspended directly over the property. The dogs were going insane, barking at the sky with a desperation that bordered on panic. I shouted at them to be quiet, needing to hear, to understand what was making that sound. But even when they paused for breath, the noise gave me no clues. It wasn't quite mechanical. There was something organic about it, a quality that reminded me of whale song played at the wrong frequency. It lasted for nearly 10 minutes. Then it simply stopped, as abruptly as if someone had thrown a switch. The silence that followed felt oppressive, unnatural. Even the insects had gone quiet. I stood in the yard, tilting my head back until my neck ached, searching for any sign of what had been there. Nothing. I began keeping a journal of the incidents, dates, times, descriptions. I told myself it was for documentation, that if things escalated, I'd need evidence. But really, I think I was trying to impose order on chaos, to find patterns where perhaps none existed. The explosions, irregular but frequent. The hovering sound, less common, but always during daylight hours. Always seeming to come from directly overhead, yet leaving no trace. I started researching the property's history, spending hours in the small town library 20 kilometers away. The limestone quarry had operated from the 1940s through the mid-1970s, employing dozens of local workers. The limestone was of exceptional quality, used in construction throughout the region. But there had been accidents. Several, in fact, though the records were frustratingly vague. One report mentioned a catastrophic structural failure in 1968 that had led to the temporary closure of the operation. Another referenced unexplained ground instabilities that had plagued the final years. The quarry's closure was documented in a yellowed newspaper clipping. Pedra Branca limestone extraction ceases operations. The article cited depleted resources and economic factors, but mentioned in passing that the company had abandoned equipment and structures on site, deeming retrieval unsafe and cost-prohibitive. I showed the librarian my property deed, asking if she knew anything about the area. She was an elderly woman, probably in her 70s, with sharp eyes behind thick glasses. She studied the document for a long moment before looking up at me. "You should talk to the people in town," she said carefully. "They might have stories." "What kind of stories?" She hesitated, and in that pause I sensed a reluctance to speak, as if words themselves might summon something unwanted. "The quarry was deeper than most people realize," she finally said. "They dug down, following the limestone veins. Some say they went too deep, found things that should have stayed buried." I waited for her to elaborate, but she simply returned the deed to me and turned back to her cataloging work. The conversation was clearly over. I began to hear the sounds in my sleep. Not the explosions. Those continued to wake me, violent and immediate, but other sounds, filtering into my dreams and sometimes bleeding through into waking consciousness. Voices, faint and distorted, speaking in a language I almost recognized but couldn't quite grasp. Scraping sounds, like metal on stone, and underneath it all, a low-frequency hum that made my bones vibrate. I started sleeping less, brewing coffee at 3 in the morning and sitting in the study with all the lights on, trying to work. The dogs had stopped barking at the explosions. Now they just whined, a constant pitiful sound that grated on my nerves. They'd lost weight, refusing to eat much, and Ronaldo had developed a bald patch on his flank, where he'd been obsessively licking. I should have left. I knew that even then, but something kept me there. Stubbornness, perhaps, or the sunk cost of having already moved my entire life to this place. Or maybe something else. Something I didn't want to examine too closely. A compulsion that felt external, as if the property itself exerted a gravity I couldn't escape. One afternoon, I returned to the clearing where we'd found the strange marks. This time I went alone, in daylight, carrying a better camera to document what I'd found. The walk seemed shorter this time, the path more defined, as if the forest itself was becoming familiar with my presence. The clearing was unchanged, except the drag marks were gone. The ground was smooth, undisturbed, covered now in a carpet of fallen leaves that looked weeks old. I stood at the edge for a long time, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I remembered. Had I imagined the marks? Had my uncle and I shared some kind of delusion that night? I took photos anyway, though I knew they'd show nothing meaningful. Just an unremarkable patch of forest floor, the kind you could find anywhere in these mountains. As I was leaving, something caught my eye. A gleam of metal partially hidden under leaves near the clearing's edge. I bent down and brushed away the debris, revealing what looked like a length of chain, thick and rusted, disappearing into the ground. I pulled on it, felt resistance, then a sudden give. More chain emerged from the soil, link by link, covered in limestone dust and corrosion. I followed it for several feet before it ended, the final link broken cleanly, as if sheared by tremendous force. The metal was still sharp at the break point. What had been chained here? And why? The hovering sound came again that night, though I'd never known it to occur after dark. I was in bed when it started, that deep thrumming that made the house resonate like a tuning fork. But this time it was different. The sound seemed to be moving, circling the property in a slow, deliberate pattern. I went to the window and looked out. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in silvery light. The forest was a dark mass against the sky, and above it, I saw something that made my breath catch. The air itself seemed to be rippling, distorting, as if I was looking at the world through moving water. The distortion was roughly circular, perhaps 100 feet across, and it was indeed circling the property. As it passed over the house, the thrumming intensified, so loud I had to cover my ears. Pictures rattled on the walls. Books vibrated off shelves. And then I noticed the dogs. They were standing in the yard, side by side, perfectly still. Their heads were tilted back, tracking the movement of whatever was above them. But they weren't barking or whining. They were silent, statuesque, as if something had switched off their fear response. The distortion completed another circuit, then another. I counted 5 passes before it began to change, the rippling effect intensifying until it looked like a hole was being torn in the fabric of reality itself. Through the distortion, I thought I could see something. Shapes, movement, but nothing my eyes could properly resolve. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, it stopped. The sound cut out. The air settled. The dogs collapsed, simply dropped where they stood, as if every muscle had simultaneously given out. I ran outside, my bare feet slapping against the wooden steps. Both dogs were breathing, but unconscious, their sides rising and falling rapidly. I knelt beside Ronaldo, checking his pulse, elevated but steady. Bella twitched, her legs moving as if she was running in her sleep. They woke up after about 10 minutes, but something had changed. They no longer cowered or showed fear. Instead, they sat up and looked at the forest with what I can only describe as expectation, as if waiting for something to emerge. I called my uncle the next morning, but he didn't answer. I left a message describing what I'd seen, trying to keep my voice steady, trying not to sound like I was losing my mind. He never called back. The explosions increased in frequency, sometimes multiple times a day now, each one shaking the foundation, disturbing the limestone dust that seemed to seep from every crack in the walls. I stopped cleaning it up. What was the point? I began spending more time in the forest, drawn by a need I couldn't explain. I found other clearings, other signs of disturbance. In one, I discovered what looked like drill marks in exposed limestone, a pattern of holes that formed a perfect hexagon. In another, I found more chain, this time still attached to a steel anchor point driven deep into rock. The people in town had started avoiding me. I'd noticed conversations stopping when I entered the general store, eyes quickly looking away. One afternoon, I overheard 2 elderly men talking near the town square. They fell silent as I approached, but not before I caught a few words. Just like the others. And quarry always takes them back. I confronted them, demanded to know what they meant. They looked at each other with the shared understanding of people who'd kept a secret for far too long. Finally, one of them spoke. He told me about the workers who disappeared in the final years of the quarry operation. Not died, disappeared. 5 men over a span of 18 months. gone without trace. The company had blamed it on workers fleeing debt or family troubles, but everyone knew better. The quarry had gone too deep, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. They'd broken through into something, a cavity or chamber that shouldn't have existed. The workers who'd seen it had refused to go back down. 3 of them quit immediately. The other 2 disappeared that same week. What was down there? I asked. The old man shook his head. They sealed it, filled it with concrete and limestone dust, tons of it. Then they abandoned the whole operation. He looked at me with something like pity. You should leave that place. The quarry's been quiet for decades, but maybe bringing someone back there, living on that land again, maybe that woke something up. I wanted to dismiss it as superstitious nonsense, the kind of folklore that accumulates around any industrial accident. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was telling the truth, or at least what he believed to be the truth. Last night I went down to the quarry. I'd found it finally, guided by old survey maps from the library. It was deeper in the forest than I'd expected, accessible by an overgrown road barely visible beneath decades of vegetation. The quarry itself was a massive open pit, its walls showing the strata of limestone like the rings of a tree. But someone, or something, had been excavating. The concrete seal the old man had mentioned was broken, cracked open from beneath as if something had pushed up from below. Fresh limestone dust covered the ground, and the drag marks I'd seen before were everywhere, converging on the opening. I stood at the edge, my flashlight barely penetrating the darkness below. The hovering sound was there, rising from the depths, but quieter now, almost like breathing. And beneath it, I heard those voices again, clearer than before. They weren't speaking Portuguese or any language I recognized. The words had a strange quality, seeming to bypass my ears entirely and resonate directly in my skull. I don't remember deciding to descend. I just found myself climbing down, finding handholds in the limestone walls, my flashlight clenched between my teeth. The air grew colder as I went deeper, and that mineral smell intensified until it was almost overwhelming. I don't know how far down I went. 50 feet? 100? The walls were marked with that same hexagonal pattern I'd seen in the clearing, precise and deliberate. And between the marks, I saw writing, formulas or symbols etched directly into the stone, glowing faintly with a phosphorescence that shouldn't exist. At the bottom, I found the chamber. It was vast, much larger than should have been possible given the surface topography. The ceiling arched above me like a cathedral, and the walls were smooth, polished, showing tool marks that were too precise, too perfect to be made by hand. In the center stood what I first took to be mining equipment, complex machinery of metal and stone, partially dismantled, with components scattered across the floor. But it wasn't mining equipment. I don't know what it was. The hovering sound was coming from it, pulsing in rhythm with those glowing symbols on the walls. And around the machinery, I saw them, the chains I'd been finding, dozens of them, all broken, all leading back to this central point. Something had been held here, something that was now free. I took photos, filled an entire memory card, and then I ran, scrambling back up the quarry walls with a speed born of pure terror, my hands bleeding from limestone cuts, my lungs burning. I made it back to the house as dawn was breaking. The dogs were gone. Their corner by the fence was empty, no sign of struggle, just absence. I'm writing this now, in the morning light, trying to make sense of what I've seen. The photos are still on my camera, but I'm afraid to look at them. Afraid of what they'll show, or perhaps more afraid of what they won't show. The house is quiet. No explosions today, no hovering sounds. Just an oppressive silence that feels like the pause before a storm. I should leave. Pack my things, get in my car, and drive until this place is far behind me. But I can't shake the feeling that it's too late for that the moment I drove up that dirt road 2 months ago, my fate was already sealed. The sun is climbing higher now, burning off the morning mist, and as it does, I see something at the forest edge that makes my blood run cold. Ronaldo and Bella, sitting perfectly still facing the house. Behind them, barely visible in the shadows between the trees. Other shapes. More dogs, or things that used to be dogs. And among them, taller figures that might have once been men. They're all just standing there, watching, waiting. The chain I found is on my desk, the broken end glinting in the sunlight. I pick it up, feel its weight. And I understand now, with a clarity that cuts through all confusion, all doubt. They weren't chained to keep something down there. They were chained to keep us from going down, from finding what was below, from waking what should have stayed sleeping. The hovering sound is starting again, rising from the earth beneath the house. The limestone dust is stirring, dancing in the air like snow. And through the window, I watch as the shapes at the forest edge begin to move slowly, purposefully, toward the house. I hear footsteps on the wooden porch, measured and deliberate. The door handle is turning, and in the limestone dust floating through the sunbeam across my desk, I see symbols forming, those same hexagonal patterns, writing themselves in the air. They're calling me back down, and God help me, I want to go.